She had nothing left but pride, and he was asking her to surrender even that. Eleanor Hayes stood in the blistering Arizona sun, staring at the cowboy who'd just proposed the most outrageous bargain of her life. Marry him by sunset, or sleep in the desert with the rattlesnakes. No courtship, no promises, just a ring and a roof in exchange for her name on a marriage certificate. Behind her lay a trail of debts and broken dreams. Before her stood a stranger with calloused hands and secrets in his eyes. The sun was already beginning its descent toward the horizon. Stay with me until the very end, because this story gets wilder than you can imagine. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from so I can see how far this tale travels. The stagecoach lurched to a stop in a cloud of red dust that coated everything. Eleanor's worn traveling dress, her cracked leather bag, even the hope she'd been clinging to since leaving St. Louis 3 weeks ago. She climbed down with legs that trembled from exhaustion and something deeper. Fear, maybe. Or the hollow ache of having absolutely nowhere else to go. Redemption, Arizona, wasn't much to look at. A collection of sun-bleached buildings huddled together like conspirators sharing secrets, connected by a main street that stretched maybe 300 yards from the saloon on one end to the general store on the other. Dust devils danced between the structures, and the July heat rose from the earth in visible waves that made the distant mountains shimmer like a mirage. Eleanor adjusted her hat, once fashionable in St. Louis, now just a shield against the relentless sun, and tried to ignore the stares of the men lounging outside the saloon. She'd grown accustomed to stares during her journey west. A woman traveling alone drew attention, most of it unwelcome. She'd learned to keep her eyes forward and her expression carefully neutral. Miss Hayes? The stagecoach driver, a grizzled man named Hewitt, who smelled perpetually of tobacco and horse, handed down her battered carpet bag. You sure about this? Redemption ain't exactly hospitable to unescorted ladies. I'm sure. Eleanor's voice came out stronger than she felt. Thank you for your concern, Mr. Hewitt. He touched the brim of his hat, doubt clear in his weathered face, then climbed back onto the driver's seat. Within moments, the coach was pulling away, leaving Eleanor alone on the edge of a town that already felt like the end of the earth. She'd come to Redemption because of an advertisement. Housekeeper needed. Room and board provided. References required. Inquire at the Redemption General Store. The notice had appeared in a Denver newspaper, and Eleanor had torn it out with shaking hands, seeing it as a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. That had been 2 weeks ago. Since then, she'd spent the last of her money on the stagecoach ticket, survived on bread and water, and tried not to think about what would happen if the position had already been filled. The general store sat at the far end of the street, its wooden sign creaking in the hot breeze. Eleanor picked up her bag, lighter than it should be, containing only 2 changes of clothes and a few personal items, and started walking. Her shoes, already worn thin from the journey, crunched against the hard-packed dirt. Well, well, what do we have here? Eleanor's steps faltered. A man had detached himself from the saloon's shade, moving to intercept her path. He was young, maybe 30, dressed in expensive clothes that seemed absurdly out of place in this frontier town. His smile was all teeth and no warmth. Lost, sweetheart? He looked her up and down in a way that made her skin crawl. Or just brave. Pretty woman like you shouldn't be wandering around Redemption alone. Eleanor kept walking, angling away from him. I'm not lost, thank you. Hold on now. He stepped directly into her path, forcing her to stop. Up close, she could smell whiskey on his breath despite the early hour. I'm just being neighborly. Name's Garrett Holloway. My father owns most of this town, which means nothing to me. Eleanor's patience, worn thin by 3 weeks of hard travel and mounting desperation, finally snapped. Please move aside. Garrett's smile hardened into something uglier. You've got spirit. I like that. But you should know that women without protection in towns like this, the lady asked you to move. The new voice cut through the heat like a knife. Eleanor turned to see a man approaching from the direction she'd been heading. Tall, broad-shouldered, with sun-darkened skin and eyes the color of storm clouds. He wore work-worn clothes, denim pants, a faded shirt, boots that had seen hard use, and a hat pulled low against the sun. Maybe 35, with the kind of face that had seen too much and said too little. There was a quiet authority in his stance, and something dangerous in the way he moved. Garrett's expression soured. "This doesn't concern you, Reed." "Maybe not." The man, Reed, stopped a few feet away, close enough that Eleanor could see the tension in his jaw, the calluses on his hands. "But I'm making it my concern. Move along, Holloway." For a moment, Eleanor thought Garrett might refuse. The air between the two men crackled with old animosity, the kind that ran deep and permanent. Then Garrett laughed, a harsh sound devoid of humor. "Your funeral, Reed. You and that worthless piece of dirt you call a ranch." He tipped his hat to Eleanor, mockery in every line of his body. "Enjoy redemption, sweetheart. Something tells me you'll fit right in with the other lost causes." He sauntered back to the saloon, and Eleanor released a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "Thank you," she said, turning to her unlikely savior. "I appreciate your intervention, though I assure you I was managing—" "Eleanor Hayes," Reed interrupted, his gaze direct and unsettling. She blinked. "Yes. How did you— You're here about the housekeeper position." It wasn't a question. "I'm Lucas Reed. I placed the advertisement." Eleanor's heart, which had been hammering from the confrontation with Garrett, now raced for a different reason. "Oh, yes. I sent a letter 2 weeks ago, but I wasn't certain. Never got it." Lucas studied her with an intensity that made her want to look away. "You came anyway?" Eleanor fought the urge to fidget under that penetrating gaze. "I had nowhere else to go." The words hung between them, too honest, too revealing. Eleanor immediately regretted them. "Never show weakness," her mother had always said. "Never let them see you bleed." But desperation had a way of stripping away pretense, and Eleanor was desperate enough to taste it. Something flickered across Lucas's face. Recognition, maybe, or understanding. "Come with me." He didn't wait for her agreement, just turned and started walking. Eleanor grabbed her bag and hurried after him, her tired legs protesting. They moved past the general store to where a wagon stood hitched to 2 sturdy horses. Lucas threw her bag into the back with an efficiency that spoke of long practice. "Where are we going?" Eleanor asked, trying to maintain some dignity despite her obvious exhaustion. "My ranch, the Double R." Lucas untied the horses, his movements economical. "It's about 5 miles out. You wanted a job interview, didn't you?" "Yes, but I thought, thinking's good. But right now, you need to get out of this town before Garrett decides to make more trouble." Lucas climbed onto the wagon seat and extended a hand to her. "Coming?" Eleanor looked at that outstretched hand, weathered, strong, belonging to a man she knew absolutely nothing about, and made her choice. She'd come too far to back away now. She took his hand and let him pull her up onto the seat beside him. The wagon lurched into motion, and redemption began to recede behind them. Eleanor watched the town disappear, replaced by vast stretches of red earth, scrub brush, and distant mountains that looked like they'd been carved from stone by an angry god. The landscape was beautiful in a harsh, unforgiving way. Nothing like the green hills of Missouri where she'd grown up, or the busy streets of St. Louis where she'd lost everything. "Who was that man?" Eleanor asked after several minutes of silence. "Garrett Holloway?" Trouble. Lucas kept his eyes on the rutted road ahead. "His father, Grant Holloway, owns half the territory and wants the other half. Garrett's his youngest son and biggest mistake. Drinks too much, thinks too little, causes problems wherever he goes. You have history with them." "Everyone in Redemption has history with the Holloways." Lucas's jaw tightened. "Some more than others." Eleanor waited for him to elaborate, but he didn't. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the creak of the wagon wheels and the rhythmic clop of the horses' hooves. She studied him from the corner of her eye, the strong profile, the tension in his shoulders, the way he held the reins with casual expertise. He wasn't handsome in the conventional sense. His features were too angular, too weathered by sun and hardship. But there was something compelling about him, something that made her curious despite her exhaustion. "How long have you had the ranch?" she asked, more to break the silence than from real interest. "The land's been in my family for 15 years. I've been running it myself for 3. "And you need a housekeeper?" "Among other things." Lucas glanced at her briefly, then back to the road. "You any good with numbers, bookkeeping?" Eleanor felt a flutter of hope. Yes, my father was a banker. He taught me accounts, ledgers, everything. I've kept books for... She stopped herself just in time. I have experience. Lucas nodded, seeming satisfied. They crested a low rise and suddenly the ranch appeared before them. Eleanor's first thought was that it looked lonely. A small cabin sat in a shallow valley, surrounded by corrals and outbuildings that had seen better days. The land stretched out in all directions, dotted with cattle that looked like toys from this distance. A windmill turned lazily in the breeze, and a thin stream cut through the property, marked by a ribbon of green vegetation that stood out against the red earth. It's not much, Lucas said, a defensive note entering his voice for the first time. But it's mine. Mostly. Mostly? Long story. He urged the horses down the slope toward the cabin. Short version, I'm fighting to keep it. That's why I need help. They pulled up to the cabin, and Eleanor climbed down before Lucas could assist her. Up close, the ranch looked even more precarious. The cabin needed repairs. She could see daylight through gaps in the walls. The corrals were sturdy enough, but the barn sagged at one corner. Everything spoke of a man working alone, stretched too thin. Let me show you around, Lucas said, tying off the horses. Then we'll talk about the position. He led her through the property, pointing out the essentials. The cabin was small, 2 rooms, one for living and cooking, one for sleeping. Currently, both were in states of barely organized chaos. Papers covered the rough-hewn table, dirty dishes sat stacked by the wash basin, and dust coated every surface. The bedroom held a narrow bed, a trunk, and little else. I know it needs work, Lucas said, sounding almost apologetic. I've been focused on the cattle, the land improvements. The inside got neglected. Eleanor nodded, her mind already cataloging what needed to be done. It was overwhelming, yes, but not impossible. And overwhelming was better than the alternative, sleeping in an alley in Denver, or worse. They moved outside and Lucas showed her the rest of the operation. He ran about 200 head of cattle, he explained, with plans to expand once the homestead was secure. He had 3 ranch hands who came in during the day, Tom, Miguel, and a kid named Jesse who was learning the trade. They'd need feeding at noon, nothing fancy, just something substantial. How much would the position pay? Eleanor asked, trying to sound professional rather than desperate. Lucas stopped walking. They stood near the corral, the afternoon sun beating down mercilessly. Room, board, and $20 a month. $20. It wasn't much, but it was something. More importantly, it was survival. A roof, food, safety. Plus the bookkeeping, Eleanor said. I saw those papers on your table. You're drowning in records. You're not wrong. Lucas's mouth quirked in what might have been almost a smile. The government's got requirements, improvements, taxes, claims. It's a mess. I can help with that. I'm good with organization, with systems. I can... Eleanor stopped, suddenly aware that she was pleading. She straightened her shoulders, trying to reclaim some dignity. When would you need me to start? Lucas was quiet for a long moment, studying her with that unsettling intensity. Then he said, I need to be honest with you, Miss Hayes. Eleanor's stomach dropped. Here it came. The refusal. The polite explanation that the position had been filled or that she wasn't suitable or any of the 100 other rejections she'd heard over the past months. The housekeeper position is real, Lucas continued. I do need help, but that's not the main problem I'm trying to solve. I don't understand. Lucas pulled off his hat, ran a hand through sweat-dampened hair. The land I showed you, the 160 acres of the Double R, I'm claiming it under the Homestead Act. You know what that is? Eleanor nodded. Everyone knew about the Homestead Act, free land for anyone willing to work it, to improve it, to make it productive. There are requirements, Lucas said. Live on the land for 5 years, make improvements, farm or ranch it. I've done all that. I've got 3 years in, 2 to go. But there's another requirement, one I didn't know about when I filed my claim. What requirement? Lucas met her eyes directly. Married men get preference. Families get preference. The government wants settlers who'll stay, who'll build communities, who'll put down roots. Single men. He shook his head. They think we'll just work the land and move on. Eleanor felt something cold begin to creep up her spine. And you're not married? No. Lucas's jaw tightened. And Grant Holloway knows it. He's been filing complaints, making trouble, using his influence to put pressure on the land office. He wants this ranch, Miss Hayes. He wanted it 15 years ago when my father first claimed it, and he wants it now. He's got the money, the connections, the lawyers. I've got... He gestured at the ranch around them. This. And it's not enough. What does this have to do with me? Lucas took a breath. There's a land inspector coming in 3 days. He's going to review my claim, check my improvements, make sure I meet all the requirements. If I'm still single when he arrives, Holloway is going to use that to challenge my homestead. He'll tie me up in legal battles for years, drain whatever resources I have left. But if I'm married... Eleanor felt the pieces click into place, felt the trap closing around her before he even finished speaking. If you're married, she said slowly, you meet the requirement. You show stability, permanence. The inspector approves your claim, and Holloway loses his leverage. Yes. So you need a wife. Yes. Eleanor took a step back, then another. Her heart hammered against her ribs. That's why you place the advertisement. Not for a housekeeper, for a bride. I need both. Lucas's voice remained steady, but she could see tension in every line of his body. I need someone to help run this place, to manage the house and the books. But I also need a wife, on paper at least, to secure the land. I'm not asking for... He stopped, choosing his words carefully. I'm not asking for a real marriage, just a legal one. You'd have your own space, your own life. I'd pay you the $20 a month, plus provide everything you need. After the homestead is secure, after the 5 years are up, we could end the arrangement quietly, file for divorce, go our separate ways. You're insane. The words came out harsh, driven by panic and exhaustion and the sheer absurdity of what he was proposing. You think I'd marry a complete stranger for $20 a month and a promise you might not even keep? I know how it sounds. Do you? Eleanor's voice rose despite her efforts to control it. I came here for a job, Mr. Reed. A simple, straightforward job. Not to become some kind of contract bride in a scheme to defraud the government. It's not fraud. Lucas's tone hardened. It's survival, mine and yours. What's that supposed to mean? It means you came here with nowhere else to go, remember? You said it yourself. No money, no prospects, no references I'd bet my ranch on. You're running from something, Miss Hayes. Same as I'm fighting for something. We both need a solution, and this is it. This is madness. Maybe. Lucas put his hat back on, his face falling into shadow. But it's the only option I've got. And unless you've got something better lined up, it's the only option you've got too. Eleanor wanted to argue, to reject the proposal outright and demand he take her back to redemption. But the words died in her throat because he was right. She had nothing. No money for another stagecoach ticket. No references that wouldn't reveal her shameful past. No family to turn to. No friends to shelter her. She'd burned every bridge getting here, and now she stood on the edge of a precipice with only 2 choices: jump or accept the hand of a stranger offering an impossible bargain. This is insane, she repeated, but with less conviction this time. Probably. Lucas's expression softened slightly. Look, I know I'm asking a lot. I know it's not fair, but I'm desperate, Miss Hayes. This ranch is all I have left of my family. My father died getting this land, and I'll be damned if I let Holloway take it without a fight. I need a wife before that inspector arrives, and you need a place to stay. It's a business arrangement, nothing more. Nothing more, Eleanor echoed hollowly. Just a marriage. On paper. For how long? 2 years minimum. That's how long until the homestead is secure. After that, Lucas shrugged. We can figure it out. I'll make sure you're taken care of, regardless. Eleanor turned away from him, staring out at the harsh landscape. The sun was beginning its slow descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, beautiful and merciless, like everything else in this territory. She thought about St. Louis, about the life she'd left behind. Her father's bank had failed, taking with it not just their money, but their reputation. The debts had been crushing, impossible. Her father had died of a heart attack trying to manage them, and her mother had followed 6 months later, worn down by shame and poverty. Eleanor had tried to hold on, had worked as a governess, a seamstress, anything to keep herself afloat. But the stigma of her father's failure had followed her everywhere, closing doors, ending opportunities. Then Thomas Warwick had come along. Charming, wealthy, promising marriage and security. She'd believed him, let herself hope, right up until she'd discovered he was already married, that she'd been nothing but a diversion, that he'd left her not only heartbroken but compromised in the eyes of society. No respectable family would hire her after that scandal broke. No decent man would consider her, so she'd run. West, toward the territories, toward anywhere that didn't know her shame. And now she'd reached the end of the line, facing a choice that was really no choice at all. "The inspector arrives in 3 days?" she asked, without turning around. "Yes." "And if we're not married by then?" "Then I lose everything." Lucas's voice was quiet, but absolute. "And you're back where you started, looking for work in a town where the Holloways make the rules." Eleanor closed her eyes. Garrett Holloway's leering smile flashed through her memory, along with 100 other indignities she'd suffered since leaving St. Louis. She was so tired of running, so tired of being afraid, so tired of having no control over her own fate. Maybe that was what decided it. Not the promise of money or safety, but the simple fact that marrying Lucas Reed would be her choice. Not something happening to her, but something she was doing. Taking action instead of just reacting. Making a decision instead of having one forced upon her. She turned back to face him. "I want $40 a month." Lucas blinked. "That's twice what you offered, I know. But I'm not just going to be your housekeeper and bookkeeper. I'm going to be your wife, at least on paper. That's worth more." Eleanor lifted her chin, channeling every ounce of confidence she didn't actually feel. $40 a month, paid on the first of every month in cash, plus room and board, plus a guarantee that after 2 years, if I want to leave, you'll pay for my passage to wherever I choose and provide references stating I was an exemplary employee. Employee? Lucas's mouth twitched. Not wife? "We both know this isn't a real marriage, Mr. Reed. Let's not pretend otherwise." He studied her for a long moment, and Eleanor forced herself to hold his gaze, to not look away or fidget or show any sign of the fear churning in her gut. Finally, Lucas nodded. $40 a month, cash on the first, passage and references after 2 years. He extended his hand. "Do we have a deal, Miss Hayes?" Eleanor looked at that hand, just as she had in town. This time, though, she understood what she was agreeing to. Not just a ride, but a life. Not just help, but partnership. Not just a job, but a marriage that was somehow supposed to be both real and not real at the same time. "When?" she asked. "When what? When would the wedding be?" Lucas glanced at the sun, now noticeably lower in the sky. "Today, before sunset. The Church in Redemption can do it, and we need witnesses anyway. The inspector will want to see a marriage certificate." "Today?" Eleanor felt dizzy. "That's only a few hours from now." "I know it's fast. It's not fast, Mr. Reed. It's insane. It's reckless and desperate and—" She stopped, hearing her own words echo back to her. Reckless and desperate. That's exactly what she was. What they both were. "Last chance to back out," Lucas said quietly. "I'll take you back to town, give you enough money for a room at the boarding house for a few nights. You can find something else, some other option. I won't hold it against you." Eleanor thought about the boarding house, about trying to find work in Redemption with no references and the Holloways watching. She thought about eventually running out of money again, about the long slide back into poverty and desperation. She thought about being alone, always running. Or she could do this mad, impossible thing. She could marry a stranger and hope he kept his word. She could gamble everything on a business arrangement that violated every rule of sense and propriety she'd ever been taught. "Miss Hayes," Lucas's voice was patient. "What's it going to be?" Eleanor Hayes looked at Lucas Reed, at the man who would be her husband in a matter of hours, and made her choice. "We should leave soon," she said, her voice surprisingly steady, "if we're going to make it back to town before sunset." Something flashed across Lucas's face. Relief, maybe, or surprise. "You're sure?" "No." Eleanor almost laughed at the absurdity of it all. "I'm not sure of anything, but I'm saying yes anyway." "Then we'd better get moving." Lucas headed toward the wagon, then paused and looked back at her. Thank you, Miss Hayes. Don't thank me yet, Mr. Reed. You might regret this arrangement before it's over. Maybe. He helped her up onto the wagon seat. But I doubt it. They rode back toward redemption in silence, both lost in their own thoughts. The sun continued its descent, turning the sky from gold to amber to deep orange. Eleanor watched the landscape pass by and tried not to think about what she was about to do. Tried not to imagine her mother's horror, her father's disappointment. Tried not to calculate all the ways this could go wrong. Instead, she forced herself to focus on practical matters. She'd need to buy a few more clothes with her first month's pay. The cabin would require a thorough cleaning before it was livable. The bookkeeping would take weeks to sort out. These were problems she could solve, tasks she could complete, not like the enormous, terrifying reality of what was about to happen. You nervous? Lucas asked suddenly. Eleanor turned to look at him. Terrified. Me too. The admission surprised her. Lucas Reed didn't seem like the kind of man who admitted to fear. But there it was, plain in his voice. What if this doesn't work? Eleanor heard herself ask. What if the inspector sees through it? Then we make sure he doesn't. Lucas's jaw set with determination. We're getting married, legally and properly. We'll live together, work together. As far as anyone in Redemption needs to know, we're a real couple who met and decided to get married quickly. It happens out here. People don't have the luxury of long courtships. And after, when the 2 years are up, then you're free to go with enough money to start over somewhere else, somewhere you can be anyone you want to be. Lucas glanced at her. That's what you want, isn't it? A fresh start? Eleanor nodded slowly. Yes, that's what I want. Then we'll make sure you get it. This is a business arrangement, Miss Hayes. Both of us benefit. Nobody gets hurt. Simple. But as redemption appeared on the horizon, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that nothing about this would be simple. She was about to marry a man she'd met only hours ago, a man she knew almost nothing about, a man who was clearly keeping secrets, fighting battles she didn't understand. She was trading one form of desperation for another, one gamble for another. And she had no idea if she'd made the right choice. The church was small and spare, like everything else in Redemption. Reverend Matthews was an elderly man with kind eyes and a skeptical expression when Lucas explained they needed to be married immediately. You're certain about this, son? He looked between Lucas and Eleanor with obvious concern. Marriage is a serious commitment. We're certain. Lucas's tone left no room for argument. Eleanor forced herself to nod in agreement. Though her heart was hammering so hard, she was sure everyone could hear it. The Reverend sighed but agreed to perform the ceremony. He sent his wife to fetch witnesses, the store owner and his wife, both of whom looked equally confused by the rushed proceedings. They gathered in the small church as the sun touched the western horizon, painting everything in shades of red and gold. Eleanor stood beside Lucas, acutely aware of the space between them, of how little she knew this man who was about to become her husband. He'd put on a cleaner shirt, she noticed, and made an effort to smooth his hair. These small courtesies made the situation feel both more real and more surreal. Dearly beloved, Reverend Matthews began, his voice echoing in the empty church. The ceremony passed in a blur. Eleanor heard herself making vows she didn't mean, promising things she couldn't promise. Love, honor, cherish, till death do us part. The words felt like stones in her mouth, heavy and wrong. This wasn't what marriage was supposed to be. This wasn't what she dreamed of as a girl. But then again, a lot of things weren't what she dreamed. Do you, Lucas Reed, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife? I do. Lucas's voice was steady, sure. And do you, Eleanor Hayes, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband? This was it. Her last chance to back out, to run, to choose hunger and uncertainty over this desperate gamble. Eleanor looked at Lucas. He met her gaze evenly, and she saw not just determination in his eyes, but something else. Respect, maybe. Or recognition. They were both survivors, both fighters, both willing to do whatever it took to protect what little they had left. I do, Eleanor said. Then by the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Reverend Matthews closed his Bible with a decisive thump. You may kiss the bride. Lucas froze. Eleanor froze. Neither of them had considered this part. "It's customary," the Reverend said gently, a hint of amusement in his voice. Lucas leaned in slowly, giving Eleanor time to pull away if she wanted. She didn't. She stood still as he pressed a brief, chaste kiss to her lips, hardly more than a touch, over in a heartbeat. But Eleanor felt it like a brand, marking her, changing everything. They signed the marriage certificate with the witnesses watching. Eleanor Hayes became Eleanor Reed with a scratch of pen on paper. Simple as that. A new name, a new life. A new desperate gamble in a long string of desperate gambles. By the time they emerged from the church, the sun had just dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky streaked with purple and crimson. Eleanor climbed onto the wagon beside her husband, God help her, and they rode back toward the Double R in twilight. Neither of them spoke. There was too much to say and no way to say it. They'd done what needed to be done, made their bargain, sealed their fates. Now they'd have to live with the consequences. As the ranch came into view, barely visible in the gathering darkness, Lucas finally broke the silence. "Welcome home, Mrs. Reed." Eleanor looked at the shadowy outline of the cabin, at this place that was supposed to be her home now, and felt a hysterical laugh building in her throat. Home. She'd sold herself into a marriage of convenience with a stranger, bound herself to a man in a cause she barely understood, all for the promise of $40 a month and a roof over her head. "Thank you," she managed to say. "Mr. Reed." "Lucas." He pulled the wagon to a stop. "We're married now, might as well use first names." "Lucas," Eleanor repeated. It felt strange on her tongue, too familiar and not familiar enough all at once. He helped her down from the wagon, and for a moment they stood there in the darkness, two strangers who were now legally bound together. Lucas cleared his throat awkwardly. "I'll sleep in the barn tonight," he said, "until we can figure out arrangements. The bedroom's yours." "That's not necessary." "Yes, it is." His tone was firm. "This is a business arrangement, remember? I'm not going to make it more complicated than it needs to be." Eleanor nodded, relief and something else. Disappointment? Warring in her chest. "Thank you." "Don't thank me. Just—" Lucas ran a hand through his hair, looking as uncertain as she felt. "Just get some rest. Tomorrow's going to be a long day." He grabbed his bedroll from the wagon and headed toward the barn without another word, leaving Eleanor standing alone in the darkness. She watched him go, this man who was now her husband, and wondered what on earth she'd just done. Inside the cabin, she lit a lamp with shaking hands and looked around at her new home. It still needed cleaning, still needed work, but it was hers now. For better or worse, this was where she'd make her stand. Eleanor sank onto the narrow bed, still wearing her dusty traveling dress, and stared at the plain gold band Lucas had placed on her finger during the ceremony. She'd become Eleanor Reed before sunset, just as Lucas had demanded. She'd made her bargain and sealed her fate. Now she'd have to live with it. Outside, she could hear the wind picking up, rattling the shutters and whistling through the gaps in the walls. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. Eleanor closed her eyes and tried not to think about everything that could go wrong, tried not to imagine all the ways this desperate gamble could destroy her. But sleep, when it finally came, brought dreams of St. Louis and scandal, of Thomas Warwick's false promises, and her mother's disappointed eyes. She woke before dawn, disoriented and alone, momentarily forgetting where she was. Then she saw the gold ring on her finger and remembered everything. She was Eleanor Reed now, wife of a rancher she barely knew, bound by law and desperation to a man fighting to keep land that might not even be his to keep. She'd gambled everything on a stranger's promise and a business arrangement that felt more like a prison sentence than a marriage. The sun was just beginning to lighten the eastern sky when she heard movement outside. Eleanor rose, smoothed her wrinkled dress, and went to face her first day as a married woman. Lucas was already up, tending to the horses. He looked up when she emerged, his expression unreadable in the pre-dawn light. "Morning," he said. "Good morning." The words felt absurdly formal given the circumstances. "Coffee's on." Lucas nodded toward the cabin. "We should talk about how this is going to work." Eleanor followed him inside, where he'd already started a fire and set coffee to boil. They sat across from each other at the cluttered table, both careful not to let their eyes meet for too long. "The ranch hands will be here in a few hours," Lucas said. "Tom, Miguel, and Jesse. They'll need to know we're married, but the fewer details they have, the better." "What should I tell them?" "That we met through correspondence and decided to marry quickly. It's not that unusual out here." Lucas poured coffee into 2 chipped mugs. "The inspector arrives tomorrow afternoon. By then, we need to look like we've been married long enough to be comfortable with each other." "Comfortable?" Eleanor almost laughed. "How do we fake that?" "We don't fake it. We just act natural. Like 2 people who decided to build a life together." Lucas met her eyes across the table. "Can you do that?" Eleanor thought about all the roles she'd played over the past year. Dutiful daughter, grieving orphan, respectable governess. Thomas Warwick's secret lover. Each one a performance, each one a mask. "Yes," she said, "I can do that." "Good." Lucas stood, draining his coffee. "Then let's get to work. You wanted to help with the books? They're all yours. Just try to make sense of them before the inspector gets here." He left her alone with the chaos of papers scattered across the table. Eleanor picked up the first document, a claim form, half completed, and felt the weight of everything settle onto her shoulders. She'd married a stranger to save his ranch and her own future. Now she had to figure out how to live with that choice and somehow make it work. The sun rose higher, flooding the cabin with harsh morning light. Eleanor Reed rolled up her sleeves and got to work, trying not to think about the stranger sleeping in the barn, or the inspector arriving tomorrow, or the 1,000 ways this desperate bargain could fall apart. She'd made her choice. Now she'd have to live with it, one day at a time, until either the 2 years passed or everything came crashing down around her. The question was which would happen first. The papers were a disaster. Eleanor sat at the rough wooden table as the morning sun climbed higher, surrounded by 3 years' worth of incomplete forms, crumpled receipts, and documents that had been started and abandoned. Lucas Reed might be capable with cattle and land, but his bookkeeping was a catastrophe. Tax records mixed with supply invoices. Improvement logs written on scraps of paper. The homestead claim documentation was so disorganized she couldn't tell what had been filed and what hadn't. She heard boots on the porch and looked up as Lucas entered, bringing with him the smell of horses and hay. "How bad is it?" he asked, reading her expression. "Worse than bad. This is 3 years of chaos." Eleanor held up a water-stained receipt. "Half of these documents are illegible. The improvement logs are incomplete. And your tax records," she shook her head. "When was the last time you filed anything properly?" Lucas's jaw tightened. "I've been busy keeping cattle alive and fences standing. Paperwork comes last." "Not anymore, it doesn't. That inspector arrives tomorrow, and he'll want to see proof of everything. Improvements, expenses, land usage. If I can't produce organized records, he'll have grounds to question your claim." Eleanor began sorting papers into piles. "I need to know everything you've done to this land since you filed. Every fence post, every building repair, every head of cattle purchased. Can you remember?" "Most of it. Most isn't good enough." "Then I'll remember all of it." Lucas pulled out a chair and sat across from her. "What do you need?" For the next 2 hours, Eleanor questioned him relentlessly while taking notes in her neat, precise handwriting. She filled page after page with dates, expenses, improvements. Lucas answered with patience she hadn't expected, his memory surprisingly detailed once she knew what questions to ask. The man who'd seemed so taciturn yesterday proved capable of lengthy explanations when it came to his ranch. "The windmill went up in April of '83, he said. "Cost $60 for materials, another week of labor to install it properly. Increased water access to the north pasture by 60%, Eleanor finished, writing quickly. "You mentioned that. What about the barn repairs?" "Last summer, storm damage took out the west wall. Had to rebuild from the foundation up." "Cost?" "Did the work myself, maybe $20 in lumber." Eleanor looked up sharply. "You rebuilt a barn wall for $20? "Used what I could salvage, cut new timber from the property." Lucas shrugged. "You learned to make do." She studied him across the table, seeing him differently than she had yesterday. Lucas Reed was poor, that much was obvious from the shabby cabin and worn clothes, but he wasn't lazy or incompetent. He was a man stretched impossibly thin, fighting to hold on to something that kept trying to slip through his fingers. "How long has Holloway been causing you trouble?" Eleanor asked quietly. Lucas's expression hardened. 15 years. Since the day my father first filed this claim. "Tell me. Why?" "It's ancient history." "Because that inspector is going to ask questions, and I need to know what we're up against." Eleanor set down her pen. "Tell me the whole story, Lucas. Not the version you'd tell a stranger. The truth." He was silent for so long she thought he might refuse. Then he stood and walked to the window, staring out at his land. "My father came to Arizona in '70, Lucas said finally. "Bought a small herd, started working this land before the Homestead Act even applied here. He built the original cabin, cleared the brush, dug the first well. This was open range back then. No one owned it officially, but it was ours through right of use. And Holloway wanted it. Grant Holloway owned the big ranch to the east. Still does. 10,000 acres of prime grazing land, but it wasn't enough for him. He wanted this valley too, wanted control of the creek that runs through it." Lucas's hands curled into fists at his sides. "When Congress opened the territory to homesteading in '75, my father filed immediately. Legal claim, proper paperwork, everything by the book. But Holloway fought it. He tried to buy us out first, offered my father twice what the land was worth. When that didn't work, he tried intimidation. Cattle disappeared. Fences got torn down. Our barn burned one night. We never could prove who did it, but everyone knew." Lucas turned from the window, his face grim. "My father refused to leave. He died 8 years ago, right here on this land, still fighting Holloway's lawyers and hired thugs. Left the claim to me and made me promise I'd never let it go." Eleanor felt something shift in her chest. "And you've been fighting alone ever since." "Had some help for a while. My brother stayed through the first year, but he couldn't take it. Moved to California, sends letters sometimes." Lucas managed a bitter smile. "Can't blame him. This place asks for everything and gives back just enough to keep you hoping. Yet you stayed." "I made a promise." He met her eyes. "And this land is all I have left of my family. My father's buried on that hill beyond the north pasture. My mother died when I was 12, but she loved this valley. She's here too. I'm not letting Holloway take what they died protecting." The conviction in his voice made Eleanor understand him in a way she hadn't before. This wasn't just about land or money. This was about legacy, about keeping faith with the dead. She understood that. Hadn't she run all the way to Arizona trying to honor her own father's memory, trying to prove that the Hayes name could still mean something despite the scandal that had destroyed it? "Then we make sure the inspector approves your claim," Eleanor said firmly. "Whatever it takes." Something like respect flickered across Lucas's face. Whatever it takes. The sound of horses interrupted them. Lucas went to the door as 3 men rode into the yard, 2 in their 30s, weathered by sun and work, and 1 much younger, maybe 17, with an eager expression that hadn't yet been worn down by the harsh territory. "That's Tom, Miguel, and Jesse," Lucas said quietly to Eleanor. "Remember, we met through correspondence and married quickly. I know." Eleanor smoothed her dress and prepared herself for another performance. The men dismounted and approached the cabin with obvious curiosity. Tom, the oldest with gray threading through his dark hair, spoke first. "Boss, we weren't expecting—" He stopped when he saw Eleanor in the doorway. "Ma'am." "Gentlemen?" Lucas's tone was casual, but Eleanor could hear the tension beneath it. "This is Eleanor, my wife. We were married yesterday in town." The 3 men stared in shocked silence. Jesse's mouth actually fell open. "Your wife?" Tom finally managed. "Boss, when did you even— How did you— "We met through letters," Eleanor said smoothly, stepping forward with a confidence she didn't feel. "I responded to Mr. Reed's advertisement several weeks ago. After corresponding, we decided there was no reason to delay the arrangement." "Arrangement?" Miguel, who had an accent that spoke of Mexican heritage, raised an eyebrow at the word choice. Eleanor felt heat creep up her neck but kept her expression pleasant. "Marriage arrangement? Surely that's not unusual out here. I've heard many frontier couples wed quickly out of practical necessity." "Sure, but Lucas never mentioned—" Jesse started. "Because it wasn't anyone's business until it was done," Lucas interrupted, his tone brooking no argument. Eleanor will be managing the house and helping with the books. I expect you all to treat her with the same respect you'd give any rancher's wife." The men exchanged glances, clearly full of questions they didn't dare ask. Finally, Tom nodded slowly. "Welcome to the Double R, Mrs. Reed. If you need anything, I'll need lunch prepared for 4 by noon," Eleanor said briskly, "and dinner at 6. I assume you're all accustomed to simple fare?" "Yes, ma'am." Tom actually smiled. "Anything's better than Lucas's cooking." "Hey," Lucas protested, but there was no real heat in it. The men headed toward the barn to start their work. Their voices low with speculation Eleanor couldn't quite hear. She turned to find Lucas watching her with an unreadable expression. "That was well done," he said. "I've had practice pretending to be things I'm not." The words came out more bitter than Eleanor intended. Lucas was quiet for a moment. "We should talk about sleeping arrangements. The hands will expect to see us living like a married couple." Eleanor's stomach tightened. "You said last night—" "I know what I said, and I meant it, but we need to be more careful now." He ran a hand through his hair, clearly uncomfortable. "I can build a partition in the bedroom, give us each privacy. But we both need to be sleeping in the cabin, not with me in the barn. Otherwise people will talk, and talk will reach the inspector." "A partition," Eleanor repeated. The idea of sharing even a divided room with this near stranger made her skin prickle with anxiety. "It's the only way to make this believable." Lucas's gray eyes were steady on hers. "I give you my word, Eleanor. A partition, separate spaces, complete privacy. I won't—" He paused, choosing words carefully. "I won't do anything to make you uncomfortable." Eleanor wanted to argue, to insist on maintaining the boundaries they'd established. But he was right. A husband sleeping in the barn while his bride took the house would raise exactly the kind of questions they couldn't afford. "All right," she agreed quietly. "A partition." Relief crossed Lucas's face. "I'll work on it this evening. For now you should focus on those papers. I'll be out checking fences with the men." He left, and Eleanor returned to her sorting, trying not to think about the strange intimacy of sharing a room with a man who was legally her husband, but remained a complete stranger in every way that mattered. The morning passed in a blur of paperwork. Eleanor created systems where there had been chaos, organized documents by date and type, filled in gaps where records were incomplete. Her father had trained her well in the precision of bookkeeping, though he'd never imagined she'd be using those skills in a frontier cabin, trying to save a desperate rancher's claim. By noon, she had enough order imposed to see the shape of things. Lucas had been telling the truth about his improvements. He'd invested every dollar back into the land. Fences, wells, buildings, livestock. The numbers told the story of a man working himself to exhaustion, barely staying ahead of disaster. They also revealed something else. Lucas Reed was nearly broke. After expenses, he had maybe $50 to his name. The 40 he'd promised Eleanor represented a significant portion of his remaining capital. She stared at the ledger, understanding washing over her. He'd offered her money he couldn't really afford because he was that desperate to keep his land. The realization made something twist in her chest. Not pity, exactly, but recognition. They really were the same, she and this stranger she'd married, both clinging to survival by their fingernails, both willing to gamble everything on one desperate play. "Mrs. Reed?" Jesse's voice came from the doorway. "It's past noon. The men are wondering about lunch." Eleanor looked up, startled. She'd been so absorbed in the numbers she'd lost track of time. "Of course. I'm sorry. I should have started earlier." She moved to the kitchen area, surveying the limited supplies with a practiced eye. Beans, bacon, flour, coffee. The staples of frontier living. She'd have to learn to stretch them, to make them last. Her mother had been an excellent cook, and Eleanor had inherited enough skill to manage. By the time Lucas and the others came in from the fields, she had beans warming on the stove, biscuits cooling on a rack, and coffee strong enough to wake the dead. "Smells good," Tom said appreciatively, taking a seat at the now cleared table. The 4 men ate with the focused intensity of people who worked hard and ate when they could. Eleanor served them and stood back, uncertain of her role. In St. Louis, she would have eaten separately, but this wasn't St. Louis. This was a frontier ranch where formality seemed out of place. "Sit down," Lucas said, gesturing to the empty chair beside him. "You worked all morning. You should eat." Eleanor hesitated, then took the seat. It felt strange sitting at a table with hired hands and her husband, though which of those words felt stranger, she couldn't say. "These biscuits are real good, ma'am," Jessie said earnestly. "Leagues better than anything Lucas makes." "That's not saying much," Miguel added, and the men chuckled. "My cooking's kept me alive 3 years," Lucas protested. "Kept you alive, sure. But alive and happy are different things." Tom reached for another biscuit. "It'll be nice having decent food around here." Eleanor felt an unexpected warmth at the simple compliment. She'd spent so long being evaluated for her family name, her social standing, her value as a potential wife to wealthy men. Being appreciated for something as basic as biscuits felt oddly grounding. After lunch, the men returned to work, and Eleanor went back to her papers. By late afternoon, she had the improvement documentation organized into a clear, chronological record that even a skeptical inspector would have to acknowledge. Lucas had done the work. She'd simply made it visible. She was creating a summary document when Lucas came in, sawdust in his hair and a hammer in his hand. "I found enough lumber to build that partition," he said. "If you'll help me measure, I can have it up before dark." They worked together in the small bedroom, Lucas cutting boards while Eleanor held them steady, marking measurements, passing nails. The physical work felt good after hours of paperwork. It also felt strangely intimate, creating this divided space that would be their bedroom. "How wide should your side be?" Lucas asked, studying the room. Eleanor considered. "I don't need much. Just enough for the bed and a place for my things." "Take half. It's only fair." "Fair would be me sleeping in the barn while you keep your own bedroom. This is more than fair, Lucas." He looked at her across the half-built partition. "You're my wife. This is your home too. Even if—" He trailed off, not finishing the thought. "Even if it's all pretend," Eleanor finished for him. "Yeah," Lucas returned to hammering. "Even if it's all pretend." By sunset, the partition stood floor to ceiling, rough but sturdy, dividing the small bedroom into 2 smaller spaces. Lucas's side held the narrow bed he'd been using. Eleanor's side had the only window and slightly more floor space. "I'll build you a bed frame tomorrow," Lucas said, wiping sweat from his forehead. "For tonight, you can have the good bed. I'll sleep on the floor." "That's not necessary." "Eleanor." His voice was firm. "You traveled for 3 weeks to get here. You've been working all day. Take the bed. I've slept on worse than a cabin floor." She was too tired to argue. "Thank you." Lucas nodded and headed outside to wash up. Eleanor sank onto the narrow bed. Her bed now, on her side of the partition, and stared at the rough wooden barrier that separated her from her husband. She could hear him moving around on the other side, hear every sound, every breath. The illusion of privacy felt as thin as the partition itself. That night, lying in darkness with only a wall of boards between them, Eleanor listened to Lucas settle onto the floor and wondered how they would maintain this strange arrangement for 2 years. How do you live in the same small space with someone, work beside them, present yourself as their partner to the world, all while keeping the careful distance of strangers? She heard Lucas shift on the hard floor, heard him sigh. "Lucas?" Her voice came out quieter than she intended. "Yeah?" "Thank you. For the partition, for keeping your word." Silence stretched between them, filled with all the things neither of them knew how to say. "Get some sleep," Lucas finally replied. "Tomorrow's going to be hard." Tomorrow. The inspector. The moment when this desperate charade would either succeed or collapse entirely. Eleanor closed her eyes and tried to sleep, tried not to think about all the ways this could go wrong. She must have dozed eventually because she woke to pre-dawn light and the smell of coffee. Lucas was already up, moving quietly on the other side of the partition. Eleanor dressed quickly, smoothing her wrinkled dress as best she could, and emerged to find Lucas standing at the stove. "Morning," he said without turning around. "Coffee's ready." They ate breakfast in tense silence, both aware of what the day would bring. Eleanor had laid out all the documentation on the table, organized and labeled, ready for inspection. Lucas had put on his best clothes, which weren't much better than his work clothes, but at least they were clean. "The inspector's name is William Garrett," Lucas said. "He's supposed to arrive around 2. We need to show him the improvements, the records, everything." And we need to look like a married couple who actually wants to be married, Eleanor added. Right. Lucas stared into his coffee cup. That might be the hardest part. Eleanor almost smiled. Just follow my lead. I've gotten good at pretending. Tom, Miguel, and Jesse arrived at their usual time and immediately sensed the tension. Tom took Eleanor aside while the others headed to the barn. Inspector coming today? He asked quietly. Yes. How did you know? Lucas has been dreading it for weeks. Holloway's been putting pressure on the land office trying to get the claim rejected. Tom's weathered face was grim. We all know what this place means to him, Mrs. Reed. Whatever we can do to help, just act normal, Eleanor said. Make it look like this ranch is well run and stable. That's all we need. Tom nodded and headed out, leaving Eleanor alone with her preparations. She spent the morning cleaning every surface in the cabin until it shone, making everything look as domestic and settled as possible. She baked bread so the cabin would smell like a home. She even found a few wildflowers and put them in a jar on the table, a small touch of femininity in the rough space. Lucas watched her preparations with something like wonder. You didn't have to do all this. Yes, I did. Every detail matters. Eleanor stepped back, surveying her work critically. We're selling a story, Lucas, the story of a couple who've built a home together. The cabin needs to reflect that. At noon, Eleanor made lunch, and the four of them ate quickly, nervous energy humming through the room. Jesse kept glancing at Lucas, clearly wanting to ask questions. Miguel was uncharacteristically quiet. Tom checked his pocket watch 3 times in 15 minutes. He'll be here when he gets here, Lucas said finally. Worrying won't change anything. But Eleanor noticed he pushed his food around more than he ate it. She understood. Everything hung on the next few hours. If the inspector rejected the claim, Lucas would lose the ranch he'd fought 15 years to protect. And Eleanor would lose her $40 a month, her safety, her fragile new beginning. At 1:30, Eleanor changed into her better dress, the one she'd been saving, the one that was only slightly worn. She brushed her hair and pinned it up properly. When she emerged, Lucas looked at her with surprise. You look... He paused, seeming to struggle for words. Like a rancher's wife. That's the idea. Eleanor's hands were shaking slightly, but she kept her voice steady. We should wait outside. It looks more natural than hovering by the window. They stood on the porch together, not touching but close enough to present a united front. The ranch spread out before them, Lucas's life's work on display. Eleanor found herself seeing it differently than she had 2 days ago. Not just a shabby collection of buildings, but evidence of years of backbreaking labor. Every fence post, every repaired board, every head of cattle represented Lucas Reed refusing to give up. There, Lucas's voice was tight. Rider coming? Eleanor saw the dust cloud first, then the horse and rider emerging from the heat shimmer. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This was it. The moment when their desperate gamble either paid off or destroyed them both. The rider approached slowly, and Eleanor got her first good look at William Garrett. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe 40, with a neat beard and wire-rimmed spectacles. He rode like someone more comfortable behind a desk than on a horse. When he dismounted, he took a leather satchel from his saddlebag and approached with a cautious expression. Mr. Reed? His voice was crisp, official. I'm Inspector Garrett from the Territorial Land Office. Inspector. Lucas descended from the porch, Eleanor following a half-step behind. This is my wife, Eleanor. Garrett's eyes sharpened with interest. Your wife? I wasn't aware you were married, Mr. Reed. My records show... We married 3 days ago, Eleanor said smoothly. In town, at the church. Reverend Matthews performed the ceremony. 3 days ago. Garrett pulled a notebook from his satchel and made a note. Rather sudden, wasn't it? No more sudden than anything else in the territory, Lucas replied evenly. People marry quickly out here. It's practical. Practical. Garrett's tone suggested he found the timing suspicious. Mr. Reed, you understand I'm here to evaluate your homestead claim. There have been concerns raised about whether you meet all the requirements. Concerns raised by Grant Holloway, Lucas said flatly. Mr. Holloway has filed several complaints, yes. As a concerned landowner in the territory, that's his right. Garrett's expression remained neutral. My job is to investigate those concerns impartially. Then investigate. Lucas gestured toward the ranch. I've got nothing to hide. For the next 2 hours, Eleanor watched Lucas lead Inspector Garrett across every inch of the Double R. They examined fences, studied the windmill, inspected the barn repairs. Lucas explained each improvement in detail while Garrett made endless notes. Eleanor followed them, offering occasional comments, trying to project the image of a supportive wife invested in her husband's success. Tom, Miguel, and Jesse made themselves scarce but visible, working steadily, showing that this was an active, functioning operation. Eleanor silently blessed them for their discretion. Finally, they returned to the cabin, where Eleanor had the documentation laid out and ready. Garrett sat at the table, studying each paper with maddening slowness. Lucas stood rigid by the door. Eleanor remained nearby, forcing herself to breathe normally. These records, Garrett said eventually, looking up, they're remarkably well organized. My wife's work, Lucas said. She's got a head for numbers. I can see that. Garrett's sharp eyes fixed on Eleanor. Where did you learn bookkeeping, Mrs. Reed? It's an unusual skill for a woman. Eleanor met his gaze steadily. My father was a banker. He believed in educating his daughters properly. A banker? Garrett made another note. And where was this? Missouri. Eleanor kept her expression pleasant despite the interrogation. St. Louis. Long way from St. Louis to Arizona. Garrett's tone suggested he smelled a story. What brought you west? This was dangerous ground. Eleanor chose her words carefully. Family circumstances changed. I needed a fresh start, and Mr. Reed needed help managing his ranch. Our correspondence suggested we were well suited to each other. Correspondence that apparently led to marriage within weeks. Sometimes you know quickly when something's right, Lucas interjected. My parents married after knowing each other 3 weeks. They had 30 good years together before my mother passed. It was the first personal detail Lucas had volunteered, and Eleanor wondered if it was true or just a convenient story. Garrett studied them both, his expression unreadable. I'll need to verify the marriage, he said finally. I'll stop by the church before I leave town. Reverend Matthews will confirm everything, Eleanor said calmly, though her heart raced. At least that much was real. The marriage certificate existed. They'd followed the law, done everything properly. Garrett spent another hour reviewing documents and making notes. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon when he finally closed his notebook and stood. Mr. Reed, Mrs. Reed, he tucked his notebook away. Based on what I've seen today, your improvements appear adequate. The documentation is thorough, and you do appear to meet the residency and cultivation requirements. Eleanor felt Lucas tense beside her. So, you'll approve the claim? I'll be making my recommendation to the land office within the week. Garrett's expression remained neutral. However, I must note that the timing of your marriage, occurring just days before this inspection, does raise questions about motivation. The timing was coincidental, Lucas said tightly. Perhaps. Garrett mounted his horse, looking down at them. I'll be honest with you both. Grant Holloway is a powerful man with considerable influence. If your marriage is legitimate, if you're truly committed to building a life here together, then I see no reason the claim shouldn't be approved. But if this is some kind of arrangement designed to circumvent the homestead requirements, he let the threat hang unfinished. It's not, Eleanor said firmly. She reached out and took Lucas's hand, lacing her fingers through his. His hand was rough and warm, and she felt him startle at the contact. We're building a life together, Inspector Garrett. On this land, in this home. Whatever concerns Mr. Holloway has raised, they're nothing but jealousy from a man who wanted what wasn't his to take. Garrett studied their joined hands, then nodded slowly. We'll see. Good evening to you both. He rode away, leaving them standing together in the fading light. Eleanor realized she was still holding Lucas's hand and started to pull away, but he held on. Thank you, he said quietly. That last part, what you said, it was exactly right. I meant it. Eleanor was surprised to realize it was true. Not all of it is pretend, Lucas. This is my home now, too. I'm not going to let Holloway or anyone else take it. Lucas looked at her, really looked at her, and Eleanor saw something shift behind his gray eyes. Recognition, maybe, or the beginning of trust. We make a good team, he said. Yeah. Eleanor finally pulled her hand free, unsettled by how natural it had felt to hold his. I suppose we do. That evening, after the hands had left and darkness settled over the ranch, Eleanor and Lucas sat at the table reviewing what had happened. The tension had drained away, leaving exhaustion in its wake. Do you think he'll approve the claim? Eleanor asked. Hard to say. Garrett's honest, which works in our favor, but Holloway has connections. Lucas rubbed his face tiredly. All we can do now is wait. And continue to act like a married couple. Yeah. Lucas stood, moving toward the bedroom. About that, your bed frame. I'll build it tomorrow, I promise. For tonight. For tonight, you take the bed, Eleanor interrupted. You've been sleeping on the floor for 2 nights. It's my turn. Eleanor, I'm not arguing about this, Lucas. Take the bed. I'll be fine on the floor. They stood on opposite sides of the partition, neither able to see the other, negotiating through rough boards. Eleanor heard Lucas sigh. We could both use the bed, he said carefully. It's big enough. We could put a blanket down the middle, keep to our own sides. Eleanor's heart jumped. That's not... We agreed. I know what we agreed, but there's no sense in either of us sleeping on the floor when there's a perfectly good bed. We're both adults. We can maintain boundaries. His voice was steady, reasonable. It's practical, Eleanor. Same as everything else about this arrangement. Practical. He was right, of course. They were married, living in close quarters, trying to convince the world they were a real couple. Sleeping in the same bed was hardly the most dramatic part of this charade. And yet, the thought of sharing a bed with Lucas Reed made her pulse race in a way that had nothing to do with practicality. All right, she heard herself say, but the blanket down the middle stays. Deal. That night, Eleanor lay on one side of the narrow bed with a folded blanket creating a barrier down the center. Lucas lay on the other side, carefully maintaining his distance. The bed was small enough that she could feel his warmth, hear his breathing, sense his presence in a way that made sleep nearly impossible. Eleanor? His voice came soft through the darkness. Yes? We're going to be all right. Whatever Garrett decides, whatever Holloway tries next, we'll handle it. Together. Eleanor stared up at the dark ceiling, listening to the wind outside, feeling the warmth of her husband, on the other side of the blanket barrier. Together, she echoed. And lying there in the darkness, Eleanor realized something that made her chest tighten with equal parts hope and fear. Somewhere over the past 3 days, this desperate arrangement had started to feel like something more. The stranger she'd married to survive was becoming someone she actually cared about. That was dangerous. This was supposed to be business, nothing more. But business didn't account for the way her heart had jumped when Lucas thanked her. Business didn't explain why holding his hand had felt natural instead of awkward. Business didn't cover the strange sense of partnership that had grown between them as they'd faced down the inspector together. Eleanor closed her eyes and tried to sleep, tried not to think about how the next 2 years would unfold in this small cabin with this complicated man who was supposed to be nothing more than a means to survival. But sleep was a long time coming, and when it finally arrived, Eleanor dreamed not of St. Louis or scandal, but of a life she'd never expected, one built on a foundation of desperation that was slowly, impossibly, transforming into something that felt almost like hope. The letter arrived 6 days after the inspector's visit. Eleanor was hanging laundry when she saw the rider approaching, dust rising behind his horse like smoke signals. She'd learned to recognize trouble by now, the way it moved deliberately across the landscape, taking its time because it knew you couldn't escape. She lowered the sheet she'd been pinning and shaded her eyes against the morning sun. Lucas emerged from the barn, saw the rider, and his whole body went rigid. "Stay here," he said, but Eleanor was already moving toward him. "If it's about the claim, I have a right to know." Lucas looked like he might argue, then nodded once. They stood together as the rider pulled up, a young man Eleanor recognized from the land office, his face carefully neutral as he handed Lucas an official-looking envelope. "Mr. Reed, Mrs. Reed." He tipped his hat. "From Inspector Garrett." Lucas took the envelope with hands that were steady only through visible effort. The rider left without another word, and Eleanor found herself holding her breath as Lucas broke the seal. She watched his face as he read, saw his expression shift from tension to confusion to something that might have been relief. "Well?" She couldn't stand the silence. He approved it. Lucas looked up from the letter, disbelief in his eyes. The claim's approved, pending final review in 2 years, but Garrett's recommendation is to grant the homestead. Eleanor felt her knees weaken. We did it. We did it. Lucas read the letter again, as if to confirm it was real. He says the improvements are substantial, the documentation thorough, and the marriage appears legitimate. He found no grounds to reject the claim based on Holloway's complaints. They stood there in the morning heat, the letter fluttering slightly in Lucas's hand, and Eleanor felt something shift in her chest. This desperate gamble had actually worked. She'd married a stranger 6 days ago, and that marriage had saved his ranch. Eleanor. Lucas's voice was rough. I don't know how to thank you. You're paying me $40 a month. That's thanks enough. But even as she said it, Eleanor knew it was a lie. The money mattered, yes, but so did this. Standing beside Lucas Reed on land that was now secure, knowing she'd helped save something that mattered. Tom, Miguel, and Jesse whooped when they heard the news. Jesse actually threw his hat in the air. That evening, they celebrated with a better dinner than usual. Eleanor had managed to make a decent stew with the supplies on hand, and Lucas produced a bottle of whiskey that had been hidden away for a special occasion. To the double R, Tom raised his glass, and to Mrs. Reed, who saved it. I didn't save anything, Eleanor protested. I just organized some papers. You did more than that. Lucas's eyes met hers across the table. A lot more. The warmth in his voice made Eleanor's cheeks heat. She looked away, unsettled by the way her pulse jumped when he looked at her like that. This was still supposed to be business, still supposed to be temporary. She couldn't afford to forget that. But that night, when they lay in the narrow bed with the blanket barrier between them, Eleanor found herself speaking into the darkness. Lucas? What happens now? What do you mean? The claim is approved. The immediate threat is over. Do we... She struggled to find the words. Do we just wait out the 2 years? Lucas was quiet for a long moment. I suppose so. Keep running the ranch. Keep playing the part of a married couple. It's what we agreed to. Right. Eleanor stared at the ceiling. What we agreed to. She heard him shift on his side of the bed, felt the mattress dip slightly. Why do you sound disappointed? He asked. I'm not disappointed. I'm just trying to understand what normal looks like now. Eleanor pulled the blanket up to her chin. For 2 years, this is my life. I want to know what to expect. Expect hard work, long days, and a lot of dust. There was a smile in Lucas's voice. Same as any ranch wife, I suppose. Ranch wife. The word settled over Eleanor like a mantle she wasn't sure she was ready to wear. But she'd put it on anyway, had agreed to wear it for 2 years minimum. She might as well learn to carry it properly. Then I'd better get used to it, she said. Sleep came easier that night, the tension of the past week finally releasing its grip. Eleanor drifted off to the sound of Lucas's steady breathing and the wind singing through the eaves, thinking that maybe, just maybe, this strange arrangement might actually work. She should have known better than to hope. 3 weeks passed in a rhythm that almost felt normal. Eleanor rose before dawn to make breakfast, worked through the morning on bookkeeping and house management, prepared lunch for the hands, spent afternoons mending or cooking or tackling the endless small tasks that kept a ranch running. Lucas and the men worked from sunup to sundown on the cattle and land improvements. Evenings, Eleanor and Lucas would sit together reviewing accounts or discussing ranch business, comfortable in a way that surprised them both. They'd fallen into an easy partnership. Lucas consulted her on decisions. She learned the rhythms of ranch work, the patterns of the seasons, the temperaments of the cattle. The blanket barrier stayed in the bed, but somehow the distance between them was shrinking anyway, in small gestures, brief touches, moments of shared laughter. Eleanor tried not to think too hard about what it meant. This was still business, still temporary. But some mornings she'd catch herself humming while she worked, or she'd look up to find Lucas watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read, and she'd feel that dangerous flutter in her chest. Tom noticed first. You two seem more settled, he said one afternoon while Eleanor served lunch. Like you've been married years instead of weeks. We work well together, Eleanor replied carefully. That you do. Tom's weathered face creased in a smile. It's good to see Lucas with someone. He's been alone too long. Eleanor carried those words with her the rest of the day, turning them over in her mind. Lucas had been alone, fighting his battles with no one to share the burden. She understood that. She'd been alone too, ever since her parents died and Thomas Warwick revealed his true colors. Loneliness was something she recognized in others because she knew it so well herself. Maybe that's why this arrangement worked. They were both solitary people who'd found an accidental partnership, both damaged enough to understand the value of boundaries and desperate enough to appreciate the comfort of not being entirely alone. That evening, Eleanor was washing dishes when Lucas came in from his final check of the livestock. He moved to help her dry, another small routine they'd developed. "Got a letter today," he said casually. "From my brother in California." Eleanor glanced at him, surprised. Lucas rarely mentioned his family. "Good news?" "He's doing well, working in a shipping office in San Francisco. He asked about me, about the ranch." Lucas set down a dried plate. "I wrote back and told him I got married." "What did you say about me?" "The truth, mostly. That you came west looking for work, that we married quickly, that you've been helping run the ranch." Lucas paused. "I didn't tell him the rest of it. The arrangement, I mean." "Probably wise." Eleanor scrubbed at a stubborn spot on a pot. "The fewer people who know the full truth, the better." "Yeah." Lucas was quiet for a moment. "Eleanor, do you ever regret it? Agreeing to this?" The question caught her off guard. Eleanor set down the pot and turned to face him. "Do you want an honest answer?" "Always." "I don't regret it. I probably should. It was reckless and desperate and half a dozen other things my mother would have been horrified by. But no, I don't regret it." Eleanor met his eyes. "Do you?" "No." Lucas's voice was firm. "You saved my ranch, Eleanor. More than that, you made it feel like a home instead of just a battleground. I don't regret asking you, and I don't regret that you said yes." Something in his tone made Eleanor's heart beat faster. She looked away, unsettled by the intensity in his gray eyes. "We should finish these dishes. Early start tomorrow." "Right." But Lucas didn't move immediately. "Eleanor?" "Yes?" "Thank you for all of it." That night, Eleanor lay awake long after Lucas's breathing had evened into sleep. Thank you for all of it. Such simple words, but they carried weight. Lucas Reed was a man who said what he meant and meant what he said. If he was grateful, it was genuine. If he valued her presence, it was real. The danger was that Eleanor was starting to value his presence too, starting to look forward to their evening conversations, starting to notice the way his rare smiles transformed his weathered face, starting to feel something that went well beyond the terms of their business arrangement. She told herself it didn't matter. 2 years would pass, and she'd move on with enough money to start fresh somewhere else. This was temporary. She couldn't afford to forget that. But the heart, Eleanor was learning, had a way of ignoring what the mind insisted was practical. The first sign of trouble came 2 days later. Eleanor was in the chicken coop collecting eggs when she heard raised voices from the yard. She hurried out to find Lucas facing down a man on horseback, older, expensively dressed, with an air of authority that didn't quite mask the cruelty in his eyes. Grant Holloway. Eleanor recognized him immediately, though they'd never met. The resemblance to his son Garrett was unmistakable, but where Garrett was weak and petulant, the father radiated cold calculation. "Don't care what that inspector said," Holloway was saying as Eleanor approached. "This marriage is a fraud, and everyone knows it." "What I know," Lucas replied, his voice dangerously quiet, "is that you need to get off my land." "Your land?" Holloway's laugh was harsh. "For now, maybe. But 2 years is a long time, Reed. A lot can happen. Accidents, losses. Maybe that new wife of yours will get tired of frontier living and head back east. Then where will you be?" Eleanor felt ice slide down her spine at the barely veiled threat. She moved to stand beside Lucas, lifting her chin to meet Holloway's gaze. "I'm not going anywhere, Mr. Holloway. This is my home." Holloway's cold eyes swept over her. "Is it? Or are you just another desperate woman who sold herself for a roof over her head? How much is he paying you, sweetheart? I'll double it if you testify the marriage was a sham." "Get out." Lucas's hand moved toward the rifle he kept near the door. "Now." I'm going, but I'll be back. Holloway turned his horse. You can't watch this place every minute of every day, Reed. Things happen on isolated ranches, fires, stampedes. Your father learned that the hard way. Maybe you need the same lesson. He rode off, leaving his threat hanging in the hot air. Lucas stood rigid, his jaw clenched so tight Eleanor could see the muscle jumping. He killed your father, didn't he? Eleanor said quietly. It wasn't an accident, but Lucas didn't answer directly. He's never been able to prove it. My father died when a fence post fell on him, but that fence was solid. I checked it myself the day before. Someone tampered with it, and the only person who benefited was Holloway. We should tell the sheriff. And say what? That I suspect Holloway of killing my father 8 years ago? That he just made vague threats we can't prove? Lucas shook his head. Holloway owns the sheriff, Eleanor. He owns half this territory. All we can do is be careful and hope he doesn't push things too far. But Eleanor heard the fear beneath Lucas's anger. Holloway had killed before and gotten away with it. What would stop him from doing it again? That night, Lucas insisted on checking all the locks twice. He moved his rifle closer to the bed. When they lay down, Eleanor could feel the tension radiating from him through the darkness. Maybe you should go, he said suddenly. I can pay you for 3 months' work, give you enough to get somewhere safe. You didn't sign up for this level of danger. Stop it! Eleanor's voice was sharp. I'm not leaving. Eleanor, no. I told Holloway this is my home, and I meant it. I'm not running away from another fight. She rolled onto her side, facing the partition between them. Besides, you need me. If I leave, it proves Holloway right about the marriage being fake. I don't want you getting hurt because of me. Then we'll make sure neither of us gets hurt. Eleanor kept her voice firm, despite the fear coiling in her stomach. We're in this together, Lucas. That was the deal. She heard him exhale slowly. Together. Together. The word hung between them like a promise neither of them had planned to make, but both seemed determined to keep. The next 2 weeks passed in uneasy watchfulness. Lucas asked Tom, Miguel, and Jesse to keep their eyes open for anything suspicious. Eleanor found herself jumping at shadows, watching the horizons for riders, checking the barn every evening to make sure nothing had been disturbed. Nothing happened, but the tension wore on everyone. Jesse startled at every sound. Miguel rode the property boundaries daily, looking for signs of tampering. Tom slept in the barn most nights, keeping watch, and Lucas barely slept at all, his exhaustion evident in the lines deepening around his eyes. This can't go on, Eleanor said one evening after the hands had left. You're running yourself into the ground. We all are. What choice do we have? If Holloway makes a move, then we'll deal with it. But we can't live in constant fear. That's exactly what he wants, to exhaust us, to make us careless. Eleanor poured coffee with hands that only shook slightly. We need to be smart about this, not just reactive. Lucas rubbed his face tiredly. What do you suggest? I suggest we set a trap. He looked up sharply. What? Holloway wants to destroy this place. Fine. Let him think he can. Eleanor had been turning this over in her mind for days. We make it look like we're vulnerable, like we're not watching as carefully. And when he sends his men, because you know he will, we're ready. That's dangerous. Everything about this situation is dangerous. At least this way we control some of the variables. Eleanor sat across from him. We could position the hands where they can watch without being seen. Keep the rifle ready. Maybe even get the sheriff out here beforehand. Tell him we're expecting trouble. The sheriff won't help. He might if we force his hand. If we have witnesses, evidence, if we catch Holloway's men in the act. Eleanor leaned forward. I know it's risky, but doing nothing is riskier. Holloway's going to make a move eventually. Better to be ready than to be caught off guard. Lucas studied her across the table, something like admiration in his tired eyes. When did you get so ruthless? About the same time I married a stranger to survive. Eleanor managed a small smile. Desperation teaches interesting lessons. That it does. Lucas was quiet for a long moment, thinking. All right, let's do it. But I want you somewhere safe when things go down. Town, maybe, or absolutely not. I'm staying right here. Eleanor, no arguments, Lucas. This is my home too. I'm not hiding while you fight for it. Eleanor held his gaze. Besides, you need me. I'm a better shot than you think. You can shoot? My father taught me. He believed women should be able to protect themselves. Eleanor didn't mention that she'd never actually shot at a person before, only targets. Some truths were better left unspoken. Lucas shook his head, but she saw respect in his expression. Stubborn. Practical, Eleanor corrected. Now let's plan this properly. We'll need to coordinate with Tom and the others, figure out the most likely points of attack, make sure we have clear lines of sight, and... She stopped because Lucas was looking at her with an expression she'd never seen before. Something raw and unguarded that made her breath catch. What? She asked. Nothing. It's just... He paused. You're remarkable. You know that? Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks. I'm practical. You're more than that. Lucas's voice was soft. You came here with nothing, agreed to marry a stranger, and now you're planning to defend this ranch like you've been fighting for it your whole life. That's not just practical, Eleanor. That's brave. She didn't know what to say. The air between them felt charged somehow, full of unspoken things that were dangerous to acknowledge. Eleanor looked away, focusing on her coffee cup. We should get some sleep, she said. Long day tomorrow. Yeah, but Lucas didn't move immediately. Eleanor, thank you for staying, for fighting with me instead of running. Where else would I go? Eleanor tried to keep her tone light. You're paying me $40 a month, remember? But they both knew that wasn't the real reason anymore. Somewhere in the past month, this had stopped being just about money or survival. It had become about something else, partnership maybe, or loyalty, or the strange bond that forms between two people fighting the same battles. That night, Eleanor lay awake listening to Lucas toss restlessly on his side of the bed. The blanket barrier between them felt increasingly symbolic, a remnant of boundaries that were already dissolving whether they acknowledged it or not. Lucas? She whispered. Are you awake? Yeah. Are you scared? Terrified, he admitted. Not of Holloway exactly, but of losing this place, of letting my father down, of getting you hurt. He paused. Are you scared? Yes, Eleanor said honestly. But I'm also angry. Holloway's been terrorizing you for 15 years. Someone needs to stop him. And that someone is us? That someone is us. She heard Lucas chuckle softly in the darkness. We're either very brave or very stupid. Probably both. Eleanor found herself smiling despite the fear coiled in her stomach. Lucas? Whatever happens, I'm glad I'm here. I'm glad I said yes that day. Silence stretched between them, loaded with meaning. Me too, Lucas finally said. Me too, Eleanor. They spent the next 3 days preparing. Tom agreed to sleep in the hayloft with a clear view of the barn and corrals. Miguel would watch the south pasture where the cattle grazed. Jesse, despite his youth, would keep watch on the creek, the most isolated spot on the property. Lucas would patrol between the house and barn, and Eleanor would stay in the cabin with the rifle, watching the road. They made it look casual, made it look like they'd relax their vigilance. Lucas even mentioned loudly in town that he'd be riding out to check the far boundaries tomorrow, leaving the ranch lightly guarded. If anyone was reporting back to Holloway, and someone surely was, the message would get through. The trap was set. Now they just had to wait and see if anyone would take the bait. The attack came 2 nights later, well past midnight, when the moon had set and darkness pressed thick against the windows. Eleanor had dozed in a chair with the rifle across her lap, startled awake by the sound of horses moving quietly through the yard. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She moved to the window and peered through a gap in the curtains. In the starlight, she could make out 4 shapes on horseback, dismounting near the barn. They moved with practiced silence, and even in the darkness, Eleanor could see they carried torches. Fire. They were going to burn the barn. Eleanor's hands shook as she carefully opened the window and aimed the rifle. She'd never shot at a person before. The thought made her stomach turn, but if she didn't act, they'd destroy everything Lucas had built. She fired a warning shot into the air, the crack of the rifle impossibly loud in the quiet night. "This is private property," she shouted. Leave now, or the next shot won't be a warning. Chaos erupted. The men scattered, cursing. Torches dropped to the ground. Eleanor heard answering shouts from the barn, Tom and Lucas emerging with their own rifles. More shots rang out, though Eleanor couldn't tell who was shooting. She aimed carefully at where she'd seen one of the intruders take cover and fired again. The rifle's kick bruised her shoulder, but she barely noticed. Adrenaline sang through her veins, washing away fear and leaving only crystal-clear focus. "Eleanor!" Lucas's voice cut through the confusion. "Stay inside!" But Eleanor was already reloading, watching for movement. She saw one of the men try to remount his horse and fired near enough to send the animal bolting. The man stumbled, fell, and suddenly Lucas was on him, wrestling him to the ground. The fight lasted maybe 5 minutes, but felt like hours. When it finally ended, 3 of the intruders had fled on horseback, but Lucas and Tom had managed to capture one, a young man maybe 25, bleeding from a cut on his forehead and looking terrified. Eleanor emerged from the cabin, still holding the rifle, and surveyed the scene. The dropped torches had been stamped out before they could catch. No one was seriously hurt except the captured man, who whimpered as Miguel tied his hands. "Who sent you?" Lucas demanded, his voice hard as stone. "I don't know what you're talking about." Lucas grabbed the man's shirt. "Wrong answer. Try again." "Lucas?" Eleanor's voice cut through. She approached the prisoner, keeping the rifle leveled at his chest. "Let me." She crouched down to the man's level, her expression cold. "You have 2 choices. You can tell us who paid you to burn our barn, or I can ride into town right now and fetch the sheriff. You'll be charged with arson and attempted murder. You'll hang." "But if you cooperate," Eleanor continued, "if you tell us everything, who hired you, how much they paid, what the plan was, then maybe we let you go with a warning. Maybe you get to walk away from this and never look back." The man looked between Eleanor and Lucas, calculating his odds. Finally, his shoulders sagged. "It was Holloway," he said. "Grant Holloway. He paid us $50 each to burn you out. Said he wanted Reed gone. Said he didn't care how it happened." "Did he say why?" Eleanor pressed. "Something about the land, about how it should have been his years ago. He said Reed's claim was illegal, that he was just correcting an old wrong." Lucas's face had gone white with fury. Eleanor put a hand on his arm, steadying him. "Thank you for your honesty," she said to the prisoner. "Now you're going to sign a statement saying exactly what you just told us, and then you're going to leave this territory and never come back. Understand?" The man nodded frantically. Eleanor turned to Tom. "Ride to town and fetch the sheriff. Tell him we've caught someone committing arson on our property and we have a confession implicating Grant Holloway. Tell him if he doesn't come immediately, we're taking our evidence to the territorial governor." Tom grinned, clearly enjoying this. "Yes, ma'am." He rode off into the darkness, and Eleanor finally let herself feel the exhaustion crashing over her. Her hands started shaking, the adrenaline draining away and leaving her hollow. Lucas noticed and gently took the rifle from her. "You all right?" His voice was soft now, concerned. "I shot at people." Eleanor's voice came out thin. "I actually shot at them. You saved the ranch. You saved all of us." Lucas's hand found hers, squeezing gently. "You were incredible, Eleanor." She looked up at him, at this man who'd become so much more than the stranger she'd married, and felt something crack open in her chest. Without thinking, she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him, needing the solid reality of him after the terror of the past hour. Lucas froze for just a moment. Then his arms came around her, holding her close. They stood like that in the darkness, surrounded by the evidence of violence averted, and Eleanor felt the last of her walls crumbling. This wasn't just business anymore. This wasn't just survival. Somewhere between the desperate wedding and this moment, she'd started to care about Lucas Reed in a way that terrified her more than any midnight attack. "We did it," she whispered against his chest. "We actually caught them." "Thanks to you," Lucas's voice rumbled through her. "I never would have thought of setting a trap. I would have just kept waiting, kept reacting. We make a good team." "Yeah." His arms tightened around her. "We really do." Miguel cleared his throat meaningfully, and Eleanor stepped back, suddenly aware of how long they'd been holding each other. But when she looked at Lucas's face in the starlight, she saw something there that made her heart skip. something that looked a lot like the feeling she was trying so hard to deny in herself. The sheriff arrived at dawn, looking distinctly unhappy to be roused from his bed. But faced with a prisoner, a confession, and 3 witnesses, including a respectable rancher's wife, he had no choice but to take their statement seriously. "I'll need to question Holloway," he said reluctantly. "Then question him," Lucas replied. "We've got evidence. We've got testimony. We're not letting this go." The sheriff left with his prisoner, and Eleanor, Lucas, Tom, Miguel, and Jesse gathered in the cabin as the sun rose. They were exhausted, running on coffee and nervous energy, but there was also a sense of triumph. "You think the sheriff will actually do anything?" Jesse asked. "He'll have to," Eleanor said firmly. "Too many witnesses, too much evidence. Even Holloway can't buy his way out of attempted arson." "Maybe not," Lucas said. "But he's not going to take this lying down. We've backed him into a corner. That makes him dangerous." Eleanor knew he was right. They'd won this round, but the war was far from over. Holloway had spent 15 years trying to take this land. One setback wouldn't stop him. But as she looked around at the faces gathered in the cabin, at Tom's weathered features, Miguel's fierce determination, Jesse's youthful courage, and Lucas's steady strength, Eleanor felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. She felt like she belonged, like she was part of something worth fighting for, like she'd found a place and people who valued her not for her family name or her social standing, but for who she actually was. "Whatever comes next," she said, "we face it together, all of us." Lucas met her eyes across the table, and the look that passed between them held more than words could say. They were partners now in truth, not just on paper. They'd fought together, bled together, protected each other. Whatever had started as a desperate bargain had transformed into something real. The question was what they were going to do about it, but that was a problem for another day. For now they had evidence to document, statements to prepare, and a ranch to protect. Eleanor rolled up her sleeves and got to work, trying not to think about the way her heart had raced when Lucas held her, or the way his touch had felt like coming home, or the dangerous truth that was becoming harder to deny with each passing day. She'd married Lucas Reed to survive, but somewhere along the way, survival had stopped being enough. Now she wanted something more, something terrifying and impossible, and absolutely not part of their original agreement. She wanted this to be real. The realization terrified Eleanor more than any midnight attack ever could. She spent the next 3 days trying to push the feeling down, to convince herself it was just gratitude or relief, or the natural bond that forms between people facing danger together. But every time Lucas looked at her, every accidental touch, every moment of comfortable silence between them, the truth became harder to ignore. She was falling for her husband. Her temporary business arrangement husband who'd married her out of desperation and would probably be relieved when their 2 years ended and she moved on. The thought made her chest ache in a way she hadn't felt since Thomas Warwick shattered her heart back in St. Louis. She'd sworn never to be that vulnerable again, never to trust a man with anything more than a business transaction. Yet here she was, lying awake at night, acutely aware of Lucas breathing on the other side of the blanket barrier, wondering what would happen if she just reached across and, "No!" Eleanor stopped that thought cold. She'd made a deal. 2 years, then freedom and a fresh start somewhere else. That was the plan, and falling in love with Lucas Reed wasn't part of it, except she was fairly certain it was already too late. "You're quiet today," Lucas observed at breakfast on the 4th morning after the attack. "Everything all right?" "Fine." Eleanor poured coffee with hands that were perfectly steady through sheer force of will. "Just thinking about what happens next. With Holloway, I mean. It wasn't entirely a lie. The sheriff had questioned Grant Holloway 2 days ago, but everyone knew the man would find a way to wriggle free. Men with that much money and influence always did. The captured arsonist had already recanted his confession, claiming he'd been coerced. The sheriff was making sympathetic noises about insufficient evidence. "We need a backup plan," Lucas said, echoing her thoughts. "Holloway's not going to stop. If anything, we've just made him more determined. Then we need something he can't buy or threaten his way out of." Eleanor sat across from him, her mind already working through possibilities. "What if we went over the sheriff's head, directly to the territorial governor? With what evidence? Our prisoner recanted. It's our word against Holloway's, and his word carries a lot more weight. Not if we can document a pattern of harassment. Not if we can show this isn't an isolated incident, but part of a 15-year campaign of intimidation. Eleanor leaned forward. You said your father documented everything, right? All the incidents, all the threats? Lucas's expression shifted. He kept journals. Every fence that got torn down, every suspicious fire, every time Holloway tried to pressure him. I have them in the trunk, but I haven't looked at them since he died. Then it's time to look. We build a case that's too big to ignore. We show that Grant Holloway has been trying to steal this land through violence and intimidation for 15 years. Maybe we can't prove this specific incident, but we can prove the pattern. That might actually work. Lucas stood abruptly. The journals are in the bedroom. I'll get them. He returned with an armload of leather-bound books, their pages yellowed with age. Eleanor cleared the breakfast dishes and spread the journals across the table. Lucas's father had been meticulous. Dates, times, descriptions of every incident. The story they told was damning. Eleanor read entry after entry, her anger building with each page. Cattle poisoned, water sources contaminated, workers threatened and run off. The barn fire that Lucas had mentioned. And through it all, James Reed's determination to hold on to land that was legally his, that he'd improved and worked and loved. Your father was a brave man, Eleanor said softly. He was a stubborn man. Lucas's voice was tight with old grief. He could have sold out, taken Holloway's money, started over somewhere else, but he refused to be bullied off land he'd earned. Like father, like son. Lucas looked up, meeting her eyes. I never wanted to be like him. Watching him fight this battle year after year, watching it consume him, I swore I'd never let anything matter that much. But it does matter. This land, this ranch, it matters to you the same way it mattered to him. Yeah. Lucas's jaw tightened. And I dragged you into it, put you in danger because I was too stubborn to walk away. Eleanor reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. You didn't drag me anywhere. I chose this. I choose to stay. Their eyes held, and Eleanor saw the exact moment Lucas understood what she wasn't saying out loud. His hand turned over, lacing his fingers through hers. The touch sent electricity up her arm. Eleanor, his voice was rough. The door banged open, and they sprang apart like guilty teenagers. Tom stood in the doorway, breathing hard. Rider coming, fast, looks official. They moved outside together, Eleanor's heart still racing from the interrupted moment. A man in a suit was riding hard toward the ranch, his horse lathered with sweat. When he pulled up, Eleanor recognized Inspector Garrett. Mr. Reed, Mrs. Reed. Garrett dismounted, his face grim. I came as soon as I heard. Is it true? Someone tried to burn your barn? Yes. Lucas's voice was cautious. 2 nights ago. We caught one of them, got a confession implicating Grant Holloway. A confession that was later recanted, I understand. Garrett pulled out his notebook. Mr. Reed, I need to ask you some difficult questions. There are people suggesting you staged the attack yourself to frame Holloway and strengthen your homestead claim. Eleanor felt fury bloom hot in her chest. That's ridiculous. We caught them in the act, so you say. But the prisoner claims he was paid by you to make false accusations against Holloway. The sheriff is considering charges. The sheriff is in Holloway's pocket, Lucas said flatly. Everyone knows it. Perhaps. Garrett's expression remained neutral. But my job is to evaluate homestead claims, and if there's evidence of fraud or manipulation, I have to investigate. I'm sorry, but I need to review your claim again. Full inspection, all documentation, interview with witnesses. Eleanor felt the ground shift beneath her feet. They'd won the first battle only to face another front. Holloway was using his influence to turn their victory against them, to paint them as fraudsters and liars. When? Lucas asked, his voice hollow. Tomorrow. I'll return with a representative from the Territorial Land Office. Garrett's expression softened slightly. For what it's worth, I believe you. But belief isn't enough. I need proof. He rode away, leaving them standing in the yard. Eleanor could feel Lucas's tension radiating like heat. He's going to find a way to take it, Lucas said quietly. All of this, the marriage, the fight, everything we've done. And Holloway's still going to win. No. Eleanor's voice was fierce. He's not. We have those journals. We have documentation of 15 years of harassment. We present that to Garrett, show him the pattern, make him see that we're the victims here, not the perpetrators. It might not be enough. Then we make it enough. Eleanor grabbed his arm, forcing him to look at her. I didn't shoot at people in the middle of the night just to give up now. We fight, Lucas. We fight with everything we have. Something shifted in his expression. Hope, maybe, or renewed determination. You're right. We fight. They spent the rest of the day preparing. Eleanor organized James Reed's journals chronologically, creating a timeline of harassment that was impossible to ignore. Lucas gathered every scrap of documentation related to the homestead: receipts, improvement records, correspondence with the land office. Tom, Miguel, and Jesse agreed to give statements about the attack and about Holloway's ongoing intimidation. That evening, exhausted and surrounded by papers, Eleanor and Lucas sat at the table reviewing their case. The lamp burned low, casting shadows across Lucas's drawn face. Thank you, he said suddenly, for all of this, for staying, for fighting, for... He paused, seeming to struggle with words. For being my partner in all of this. Eleanor's heart squeezed. We're in this together. That's what partners do. It's more than that, though, isn't it? Lucas's gray eyes were intense on hers. This stopped being just a business arrangement weeks ago, at least for me. Eleanor's breath caught. This was dangerous territory, the kind of conversation that could change everything. She should deflect, should keep the boundaries intact, should protect herself from the inevitable pain when this all ended. But she was so tired of protecting herself, so tired of walls and pretense and denying what she felt. Yes, she whispered, it's more than that. Lucas stood and moved around the table, pulling Eleanor to her feet. They stood close, not quite touching, the air between them charged with all the things they'd been carefully not saying. I never expected this, Lucas said softly. When I asked you to marry me, I thought it would be simple, a business arrangement, nothing more. But you... He reached up, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. You're extraordinary, Eleanor. You're brave and smart and stubborn, and somewhere along the way I stopped thinking about this as temporary. Eleanor's heart was hammering so hard she could barely breathe. What are you saying? I'm saying that when the 2 years are up, I don't want you to leave. I'm saying that this marriage might have started as a fraud, but I want to make it real. His hand cupped her cheek. If you want that too. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. She'd been so certain she'd never trust anyone again after Thomas, never let herself be vulnerable, never risk her heart. But Lucas Reed wasn't Thomas Warwick. Lucas was honest and hardworking and decent. Lucas had kept every promise he'd made. I want that, she said. I want it so much it terrifies me. Why? Because I've been hurt before. Because I'm scared of trusting someone completely and having them destroy me. The words tumbled out before she could stop them. I came here running from a man who made me believe he loved me, who promised me everything, and then I discovered he was married and I was nothing but his secret shame. I swore I'd never... Lucas's arms came around her, pulling her close. I'm not him. Whatever he did to you, whoever hurt you, I'm not him, Eleanor. I keep my promises. When I say I want this to be real, I mean it. Eleanor buried her face against his chest, breathing in the familiar scent of him, horse and hay and honest sweat. How do we do this? We're already married, but we're not really married. How do we... We start over. Lucas pulled back just enough to see her face. We stop pretending this is business. We stop sleeping with a blanket between us like we're afraid to admit what we feel. We build something real on purpose this time. What if Holloway wins? What if we lose the ranch? Then we lose it together. And we find something else, somewhere else, and we build that together too. Lucas's voice was steady, sure. I don't need this specific piece of land, Eleanor. I need you. The rest we can figure out? It was the right thing to say. The perfect thing. Eleanor rose on her toes and kissed him, finally crossing that last barrier between them. Lucas made a surprised sound then kissed her back with an intensity that stole her breath. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Eleanor was trembling. "We should probably sleep," she managed. "Big day tomorrow." "Yeah." Lucas's voice was rough. Do you want me to sleep on the floor, or no more barriers?" Eleanor took his hand. "No more pretending. If we're doing this, let's actually do it." That night, they lay in the narrow bed with no blanket between them, Eleanor's head on Lucas's shoulder, his arm around her. It felt natural in a way that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. "Tell me about him," Lucas said quietly. "The man who hurt you." Eleanor stiffened. "Why?" "Because I want to know what I'm up against, what ghosts I'm competing with." She was quiet for a long moment, debating how much to reveal. Then she started talking, telling him about Thomas Warwick and his lies, about the scandal when his wife discovered them, about losing everything, reputation, prospects, any chance at a respectable life. "I thought I loved him," Eleanor said, "but looking back, I think I just loved the idea of being saved. My father had just died, debts were crushing us, and Thomas seemed like the answer. I was so desperate to believe his promises that I ignored every warning sign." "That's not your fault, isn't it? I was naive, stupid. I let myself be used." "You were human." Lucas's arms tightened around her. "And you survived. You came out here and started over and built something new. That takes courage." Eleanor closed her eyes, letting his words soothe old wounds. "I'm terrified of making the same mistake twice, of trusting someone who will betray me. Then I'll just have to prove I'm trustworthy, every day, for as long as it takes." Simple words, but spoken with such conviction that Eleanor felt something in her chest unlock. Maybe this was worth the risk. Maybe Lucas Reed was worth gambling on. She fell asleep in his arms, and for the first time since leaving St. Louis, she slept without nightmares. Morning came too soon. Eleanor woke to find Lucas already up, dressed, standing at the window watching the sunrise. She could see the tension in his shoulders, the worry he was trying to hide. "Inspector Garrett will be here by noon," he said without turning around. "One way or another, this ends today." Eleanor rose and moved to stand beside him. "Then we make sure it ends our way." He looked down at her, and despite the fear in his eyes, he smiled. "Our way. I like the sound of that." They ate breakfast in tense silence, both lost in their own thoughts. Tom, Miguel, and Jesse arrived early, ready to give their statements. Eleanor laid out all the documentation on the now familiar table, creating a visual timeline of harassment that was impossible to ignore. Inspector Garrett arrived precisely at noon, accompanied by a stern-looking woman introduced as Mrs. Adelaide Thornton from the Territorial Land Office. They surveyed the assembled evidence with carefully neutral expressions. "This is quite a collection," Mrs. Thornton said, her sharp eyes scanning the journals. "How long did it take you to compile this?" "These are my father's journals," Lucas explained. "He documented every incident for 15 years. Every threat, every act of sabotage, every attempt by Grant Holloway to drive him off this land." Garrett was reading through the entries, his expression growing increasingly grim. "If even half of this is true—" "It's all true," Eleanor interrupted. "Every word. And it's been happening for 15 years, long before Lucas and I ever met. The attack the other night wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern." Mrs. Thornton fixed her with a penetrating stare. "Mrs. Reed, there are accusations that you and your husband staged the recent attack to strengthen your claim. How do you respond?" "I respond by asking what possible benefit we'd gain from setting our own barn on fire." Eleanor kept her voice level. "We caught the arsonists in the act. We have witnesses. The only reason their confession was recanted is because Grant Holloway has the money and influence to intimidate anyone who speaks against him." "Including the sheriff?" "Especially the sheriff." Garrett and Mrs. Thornton exchanged glances. Then Garrett said carefully, "That's a serious accusation." "It's a serious situation." Lucas stepped forward. "My father died fighting for this land. I've spent 8 years continuing that fight. We're not staging anything. We're defending what's legally ours against a man who's used violence and intimidation for 15 years to try to steal it." "And the timing of your marriage?" Mrs. Thornton pressed. "You must admit it appears convenient." "The timing was coincidental." Eleanor met the woman's eyes steadily. I came west looking for work. Lucas needed help. We corresponded, met, and decided to marry. That we happened to fall in love in the process doesn't invalidate our homestead claim. It was the first time she'd said the word love out loud. Lucas's hand found hers, squeezing gently. Mrs. Thornton's severe expression softened slightly. You genuinely care for each other, I can see that. But caring isn't enough if the marriage was contracted primarily for legal advantage. Then let me be clear. Eleanor's voice rang with conviction. I married Lucas Reed because I had nowhere else to go. That's true. But I stayed because I chose to. I fought for this ranch because it's my home. And if you reject this claim, you're not just punishing us. You're rewarding a bully who's been terrorizing honest homesteaders for 15 years. The room fell silent. Garrett and Mrs. Thornton were both staring at Eleanor with new respect. Even Lucas looked surprised by her passionate defense. Finally, Mrs. Thornton spoke. Inspector Garrett, your assessment? Garrett set down the journal he'd been reading. Based on the documentation, the improvements, and the testimony I've gathered, I believe the Reeds have a legitimate claim. The marriage appears genuine, if unconventional. And these journals, he gestured to James Reed's books, these suggest a pattern of harassment that warrants further investigation. Further investigation into Grant Holloway's activities, Mrs. Thornton clarified. Yes, ma'am. Eleanor felt her knees weaken with relief. Lucas's hand tightened on hers. Mrs. Thornton stood, gathering her papers. Mr. Reed, Mrs. Reed, I'm recommending approval of your homestead claim. Pending the standard 2-year review, this land is yours. Additionally, I'll be forwarding these journals to the territorial governor with a recommendation for a formal inquiry into Mr. Holloway's business practices. Thank you, Lucas managed, his voice thick with emotion. Don't thank me yet. Grant Holloway is a powerful man. This won't be the end of your troubles with him. Mrs. Thornton's expression was sympathetic but realistic. But you've built a strong case, and you've proven your commitment to this land. That counts for something. After they left, Eleanor and Lucas stood in the yard watching the dust settle behind the departing horses. Tom, Miguel, and Jesse emerged from the barn where they'd been waiting, reading the victory in Lucas and Eleanor's faces. We did it? Tom asked. We did it, Lucas confirmed. Jesse whooped. Miguel grinned broadly. Tom just nodded, satisfaction in his weathered face. Drinks are on the boss tonight, Tom declared. We're celebrating. But Eleanor was looking at Lucas, seeing the relief and disbelief and joy warring in his expression. When the hands headed back to the barn, still celebrating, Lucas turned to her. We actually did it. We did. Eleanor couldn't stop smiling. The claim is secure. Holloway's going to be investigated. We won. You won. Lucas pulled her close. You're the one who thought to use my father's journals. You're the one who made the case. Eleanor, you saved this ranch. We saved it together. Together. Lucas kissed her forehead, then her cheeks, then finally her mouth, sweet and slow and full of promise. I love you, Eleanor Reed. I know that wasn't part of our original agreement, but I love you too. The words came easily now, no longer frightening. And you're right. It wasn't part of the agreement, but I'm very glad we're renegotiating terms. Lucas laughed. Actually laughed. And Eleanor realized she'd never heard that sound from him before. It transformed his face, making him look younger, lighter, like a burden he'd been carrying for years had finally lifted. What now? She asked. Now we live? We run this ranch? We build our life? We stop fighting just to survive and start actually enjoying what we've built. Lucas looked around at the land that had nearly cost him everything. My father spent 15 years fighting for this place. I spent 8 years doing the same. I don't want to spend the rest of my life in a battle. I want to spend it with you, making this place a real home. Eleanor followed his gaze, seeing the ranch differently now. Not a battlefield, but a home. Not a desperate refuge, but a foundation for the future. The cabin that had seemed so shabby when she arrived now looked like possibility. The harsh landscape that had intimidated her now felt like freedom. Then that's what we'll do, she said. That evening, after Tom, Miguel, and Jesse had left with their celebratory whiskey, Eleanor and Lucas sat on the porch watching the sun set over their land. Their land, legally and finally. The sky blazed orange and red and purple, painting the mountains in impossible colors. "I keep thinking about that first day," Eleanor said, "when you made me that outrageous proposal. Marry you by sunset or nothing. I was desperate. So was I. That's why it worked." Eleanor leaned against his shoulder. Two desperate people making a desperate bargain. And somehow turning it into something real. "Yeah," Eleanor smiled. "Somehow." Lucas was quiet for a moment, then said carefully, "Eleanor, about your past, about that man who hurt you. You never have to tell me more than you want to, but you should know that whatever happened before you came here, whatever mistakes you think you made, none of that matters to me. You're not that desperate woman anymore. You're Eleanor Reed, and you're the strongest person I know." Tears stung Eleanor's eyes. She'd carried the shame of the scandal for so long, let it define her for so long. But Lucas was right. She wasn't that person anymore. She'd built something new out here in the Arizona territory, something that belonged only to her. "Thank you," she whispered, "for seeing me, the real me. Always." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun disappeared below the horizon and stars began to emerge. The night was cool, the air finally releasing the day's heat. In the distance, cattle lowed softly. An owl called from somewhere near the creek. "This is home," Eleanor said, surprised by how much she meant it. "I never thought I'd have that again after everything fell apart in St. Louis. But this is home." "It is now." Lucas stood and pulled her to her feet. "Come on, Mrs. Reed, let's go to bed." They walked into the cabin hand in hand, no longer strangers pretending to be married, but partners who'd chosen each other through fire and fear and fighting. The partition Lucas had built still stood in the bedroom, but they both knew it was obsolete now. Tomorrow they'd take it down. Tonight they'd simply ignore it. Eleanor changed into her nightgown while Lucas banked the fire. When they finally climbed into the narrow bed, their bed now, truly, Eleanor fitted herself against Lucas's side like she belonged there. "Lucas," she said into the darkness, "no regrets?" "Not a single one. You?" "Not anymore." Eleanor closed her eyes, feeling safe and loved and home in a way she'd never expected. Not anymore. Outside, the wind sang through the valley, carrying with it the promise of rain. The ranch settled into nighttime quiet, every building and fence post a testament to years of struggle and determination. Grant Holloway would likely try something else eventually. Men like him always did. But whatever came next, Eleanor and Lucas would face it together. They'd married as strangers in a desperate gamble for survival. They'd survived the inspector, the attack, the accusations, every obstacle thrown in their path. And through it all, they'd discovered something neither of them had been looking for. They'd found each other. And that, Eleanor thought as she drifted toward sleep, was worth every risk, every fear, every moment of uncertainty. The desperate bargain had become the best decision of her life, and the stranger who'd demanded she marry him by sunset had become the man she couldn't imagine living without. Tomorrow, they'd wake up and face whatever challenges came next. But tonight, Eleanor Reed slept peacefully in her husband's arms, in their home, on their land, finally believing that happy endings were possible after all, even for desperate people who'd gambled everything on one outrageous proposal, especially for them. The partition came down 3 days later on a bright Saturday morning when the hands had the day off, and the ranch was quiet except for the sounds of cattle and wind. Lucas and Eleanor worked together, pulling boards loose and stacking them carefully near the barn where they could be repurposed for other projects. Each plank removed felt symbolic, like dismantling the last barriers between who they'd pretended to be and who they actually were. "Strange," Eleanor said, surveying the now open bedroom. "It feels bigger without that wall, but also more intimate." That was the idea. Lucas wrapped his arms around her waist from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "No more pretending, no more boundaries we don't actually want." Eleanor leaned back against him, marveling at how natural this felt. 2 months ago, she'd been a desperate woman fleeing scandal with nothing but a carpetbag and shattered dreams. Now she stood in a home she'd fought for, in the arms of a man she loved, watching their future unfold across 160 acres of Arizona territory. "I should write to your brother," she said. "Properly introduce myself. He should know you didn't just acquire a housekeeper." Lucas chuckled. He's going to be shocked. Last he knew, I was a confirmed bachelor who'd rather face down cattle rustlers than make conversation with women. What changed? You showed up and refused to be intimidated by anything. Not the desert, not Holloway, not even me. Lucas turned her in his arms so they were facing each other. "You're remarkable, Eleanor Reed. I hope you know that." She did know it, or at least she was beginning to believe it. The woman who'd stepped off that stagecoach had been broken and desperate, willing to accept any terms just to survive another day. But somewhere in the process of fighting for this ranch, she'd found pieces of herself she thought Thomas Warwick had destroyed. Strength, courage, the ability to trust again. "We should celebrate," Lucas said. "Properly, I mean. We got married in a rush with no celebration, no guests, nothing. We should do something special." "Like what?" "I don't know. Dinner in town? Invite Tom and the others? Actually enjoy being married instead of just using it as a legal strategy?" Lucas grinned. "We could even dance. There's a social at the church next Saturday." Eleanor laughed at the image of serious, taciturn Lucas Reed at a church social. "You want to dance with me in front of the whole town? I want everyone to know that Eleanor Reed is my wife by choice, not just by necessity." His expression turned serious. "I want to stop hiding. We won the battle, Eleanor. We should be able to enjoy the victory." "Then let's do it. All of it. Dinner, dancing, celebrating." Eleanor rose on her toes and kissed him. "Let's show redemption exactly who we are." The week passed in a blur of work and planning. Eleanor sewed a new dress from fabric she bought in town with her first month's wages. $40 that Lucas had insisted on paying even though money was still tight. The dress was simple but beautiful, deep blue calico that brought out her eyes and made her feel pretty, in a way she hadn't since leaving St. Louis. Lucas bought a new shirt and actually let Eleanor trim his hair, sitting patiently on a kitchen chair while she worked with careful concentration. When she finished and held up the small mirror they owned, he barely recognized himself. "I look respectable," he said, surprised. "You look handsome." Eleanor kissed the top of his head. "You've always been handsome, but now everyone else will see it too." The church social was everything Eleanor had hoped for and feared in equal measure. The whole town seemed to be there. Families with children, elderly couples who'd been married 50 years, young people eyeing each other with shy interest. And at the center of it all, Grant Holloway holding court like the king he imagined himself to be. Eleanor felt Lucas tense beside her when they entered the church hall. She squeezed his hand. "We have every right to be here," she said quietly. "This is our community too." "I know, it's just—" Lucas's jaw tightened as Holloway's gaze found them across the room. "He's not going to let this go." "Then let him stew in his own bitterness while we enjoy ourselves." Eleanor pulled Lucas toward where Tom, Miguel, and Jesse stood with their families. "Come on." Tom's wife Martha was a warm, generous woman who immediately pulled Eleanor into conversation about recipes and household management. Miguel's wife Rosa spoke limited English, but communicated volumes with her smile and gentle manner. Even young Jesse had brought a girl, sweet, shy Annie, from the general store who blushed whenever Jesse looked at her. Eleanor found herself relaxing, laughing at Tom's stories and Rosa's teasing of Miguel. This was what community felt like. Not the rigid social hierarchies of St. Louis where one scandal could destroy you, but genuine connection based on shared struggles and mutual respect. When the music started, a fiddle player and guitarist providing enthusiastic, if not entirely polished entertainment, Lucas surprised Eleanor by leading her to the makeshift dance floor. "I thought you didn't dance," she said as he placed one hand on her waist. "I don't." "Well," Lucas grinned sheepishly, "but I'm willing to embarrass myself for you." He wasn't terrible, just rusty, his movements stiff with self-consciousness. But Eleanor didn't care. She was dancing with her husband at a church social, surrounded by people who were becoming friends, in a town that was becoming home. A few missteps didn't matter. They were halfway through the second dance when Grant Holloway cut in. "May I?" He didn't wait for permission, simply stepped between them with the confidence of a man accustomed to taking what he wanted. Lucas's hand tightened on Eleanor's waist. The lady's dancing with her husband. And now she'll dance with her neighbor. Holloway's smile was all teeth. Unless you're afraid to let your bride out of your sight, Reed, worried she might realize what a poor bargain she made? Eleanor felt Lucas about to respond and knew it would be with his fists. She placed a calming hand on his chest. One dance, she said quietly. Then we leave. Don't give him the satisfaction of making a scene. Lucas looked like he wanted to argue, but finally nodded and stepped back. Eleanor turned to Holloway with a pleasant expression that masked her roiling stomach. One dance, Mr. Holloway. Then you'll excuse us. Holloway led her into the dance with practiced ease. Up close, Eleanor could see the age lines around his eyes, the gray threading his hair, the hardness that came from years of getting his way through money and intimidation. You're a clever woman, Mrs. Reed, Holloway said conversationally. Cleverer than I gave you credit for. That performance with the inspector was masterful. It wasn't a performance. It was the truth. Was it? A desperate woman agrees to marry a failing rancher to secure his homestead claim, then presents their arrangement as a love story? Holloway's grip tightened slightly. I know a business transaction when I see one. Then you should recognize that our business is none of yours. Eleanor kept her voice level despite her anger. The claim is approved. The investigation into your activities is ongoing. You lost, Mr. Holloway. Accept it with whatever grace you can manage. I never lose. Not permanently. His cold eyes bored into hers. Reed thinks he's won because some bureaucrats approved his claim. But 2 years is a long time. Accidents happen. Ranches fail. Wives disappear. The threat was unmistakable. Eleanor felt ice slide down her spine, but refused to show fear. If anything happens to me or Lucas, those journals go directly to the territorial governor. We've made arrangements. It was a bluff, but Holloway didn't need to know that. You touch us, and you'll hang for murder. Murder? Holloway laughed softly. Who said anything about murder? I'm simply observing that frontier life is dangerous. People get hurt. Businesses fail. It's tragic, but it happens. The music ended. Eleanor stepped back immediately, breaking his hold. Thank you for the dance, Mr. Holloway. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'd like to return to my husband. She walked away without waiting for a response, her heart hammering but her head held high. Lucas met her halfway, his expression dark with barely controlled fury. What did he say? Nothing we didn't already know. He's a bully and a coward who uses threats because he can't win fairly. Eleanor took Lucas's arm. Let's go home. They said their goodbyes and left, the night air cool and welcome after the stuffy church hall. They rode back to the ranch in silence, both processing the encounter. He's not going to stop, Lucas finally said. The investigation, the approved claim, none of it matters to him. He'll keep coming at us until he wins, or we're dead. Then we make sure he doesn't win. Eleanor's voice was firm. And we make sure those journals are somewhere he can't get to them, maybe with a lawyer in another territory, with instructions to release them if anything happens to us. Lucas looked at her with renewed admiration. You're always thinking 3 steps ahead, aren't you? I have to be. Men like Holloway count on people being too scared or too tired to keep fighting. Eleanor squeezed his hand. But we're not going to stop fighting. We're just going to fight smarter. Over the next several weeks, they did exactly that. Lucas rode to Tucson and left copies of James Reed's journals with a lawyer there, along with a detailed account of Holloway's harassment and threats. Eleanor wrote letters to the territorial governor's office, documenting every encounter and keeping meticulous records. They made sure Tom, Miguel, and Jesse knew where the evidence was stored and what to do if anything happened. But they also lived. They worked the ranch and improved the land and made plans for the future. Lucas talked about expanding the herd once they had more capital. Eleanor started a small vegetable garden near the cabin, coaxing life from the harsh soil. They took evening walks together, watching the sun set over their land, talking about everything and nothing. One evening, about 3 months after the church social, Eleanor realized her monthly courses were late. Then another week passed and another, and she had to face the truth. She was pregnant. The realization sent her reeling. A baby. She and Lucas were going to have a baby. This arrangement that had started as pure business, this marriage of convenience, was about to become irrevocably real in the most permanent way possible. Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed, one hand pressed to her still flat stomach, and tried to process the enormity of it. A child. A life they'd created together. The ultimate proof that this was no longer pretend. She heard Lucas come in from checking the livestock and took a deep breath. Time to tell him. Eleanor? He appeared in the bedroom doorway, concern creasing his face. What's wrong? You look pale. I'm fine. Better than fine, actually. Eleanor stood and took his hands. Lucas, I need to tell you something. His expression shifted to worry. What is it? I'm pregnant. The words hung in the air between them. Eleanor watched emotions flicker across Lucas's face. Shock, disbelief, dawning joy. Then his arms were around her, holding her close. A baby, he said, his voice rough with emotion. We're going to have a baby. Yes? Eleanor pulled back to see his face. I know this wasn't part of the original plan, but, stop. Lucas cupped her face in his hands. Stop talking about the original plan. That plan stopped mattering months ago. He placed his hand gently on her stomach. This is the best news I've ever heard. Eleanor felt tears spill over. You're sure? Because a child changes everything. It means we can never go back to just business. It means we're a family. Lucas kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her mouth. It means everything I never let myself hope for. Eleanor, I love you. I want a life with you. I want children and a home and everything we're building here. I have since before I even admitted it to myself. I love you too. Eleanor laughed through her tears. I can't believe this is real sometimes. That desperate proposal, that insane bargain, and now we're here. Actually happy. More than happy. Lucas pressed his forehead to hers. I'm grateful. For you, for this baby. For every moment that led us here. They told Tom, Miguel, and Jesse the next day. The men reacted with joy and backslapping congratulations. Martha and Rosa immediately began planning, offering advice, and hand-me-down baby clothes. Even young Jesse seemed excited, declaring he'd teach the baby to ride as soon as it could walk. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through fall and into winter. Eleanor continued working as long as she could, though Lucas grew increasingly protective, trying to take over every task. They argued about it regularly. I'm pregnant, not fragile, Eleanor said for the 10th time, refusing to let Lucas carry a basket of laundry. Women have babies while working ranches all the time. Not my wife, not if I can help it. Your wife is perfectly capable of carrying a basket. But Eleanor was secretly touched by his concern. Winter brought challenges. A harsh storm killed 3 head of cattle and damaged part of the barn roof. Money was tight again as they tried to rebuild their small herd. But they weathered it together, making do with what they had and planning for better times ahead. In February, word reached them that the territorial investigation had concluded. Grant Holloway was facing multiple charges related to his business practices, including land fraud and witness intimidation. He'd avoided charges related to James Reed's death. There simply wasn't enough evidence after 8 years. But his empire was crumbling. Several of his properties were being seized. His influence was waning. It's over, Lucas said, staring at the official notice. He's finally facing consequences. About time. Eleanor was 8 months pregnant now, moving slowly but still managing the household. Maybe now we can actually live in peace. But peace came with a price neither of them expected. 2 weeks later, Tom rode in with news from town. Grant Holloway was dead. Heart attack, Tom explained as Lucas and Eleanor absorbed the shock. Happened yesterday. He was at home when it hit, dead before the doctor arrived. Eleanor sank into a chair, one hand on her swollen belly. Holloway had been the villain in their story for so long that his absence felt strange, almost anticlimactic, all that fighting, all that fear, and in the end, he simply died. I thought I'd feel relieved, Lucas said that evening, but mostly I just feel empty. All those years fighting him, watching him destroy my father, and he just dies. No justice, no punishment, just gone. Maybe that is the justice. Eleanor took his hand. He died bitter and disgraced, watching everything he built fall apart. And we're here, together, about to have a baby, building a life on land that's finally, truly ours. I'd say we got the better end of that bargain. Lucas squeezed her hand. You're right, we did. Their daughter was born 3 weeks later on a warm March afternoon. The labor was long and difficult, attended by Martha and Rosa while Lucas paced outside wearing a groove in the porch boards. But when he finally heard the baby's cry and was allowed inside, none of the fear and worry mattered. Eleanor lay exhausted in their bed holding a tiny red-faced infant with a shock of dark hair. She looked up as Lucas entered, her face transformed by exhausted joy. "Meet your daughter," she said softly. Lucas approached slowly, almost afraid to breathe. The baby was so small, so perfect, her tiny fists waving as she fussed. He reached out one calloused finger and touched her hand. Immediately the infant's fingers closed around his. "She's beautiful," he managed, his voice thick. "What should we name her?" They discussed names but never settled on one. Now, looking at this tiny life they'd created, Eleanor knew exactly what to call her. Rose. Rosemary Reed. Eleanor smiled. Strong, beautiful, and impossible to kill, like us. Rose. Lucas carefully sat on the edge of the bed, unable to take his eyes off his daughter. It's perfect. She's perfect. The first year with Rose was exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. She was a fussy baby who rarely slept and demanded constant attention. But watching Lucas with their daughter, this hard, weathered man reduced to complete devotion by a tiny infant, made Eleanor fall in love with him all over again. He sang to Rose in the evenings, his rough voice gentle as he rocked her. He built her a cradle that he carved with intricate designs during the long winter nights. He refused to let Eleanor do night feedings alone, insisting they share the burden. "She's my daughter too," he said when Eleanor protested. "You carried her for 9 months. The least I can do is walk the floor with her at 3 in the morning." The ranch continued to grow. With Holloway's death, several smaller ranchers who'd been intimidated into selling their land at unfair prices were able to reclaim their properties. The whole valley seemed to breathe easier without his oppressive presence. Tom took over management of the day-to-day operations, freeing Lucas to focus on expansion and long-term planning. Eleanor kept the books and managed the household, now with Rose strapped to her back in a sling Rosa had shown her how to make. She discovered she loved being a mother, loved watching Rose discover the world, loved the fierce protectiveness that surprised her with its intensity. "I never thought I'd have this," she told Lucas one evening as they sat on the porch watching their daughter toddle unsteadily across the yard. "After everything that happened in St. Louis, I thought I'd destroyed any chance at a family." "You didn't destroy anything. That man tried to destroy you, but you survived. You came out here and built something better than anything you left behind." Lucas pulled her close. "You're an amazing mother, Eleanor, and an amazing wife. I'm the luckiest man in Arizona." "We're both lucky." Eleanor watched Rose stumble and catch herself, giggling at her own clumsiness. "That we found each other, that we took that crazy chance. Everything could have gone so wrong. But it didn't. We made it work." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun set, painting the sky in familiar oranges and reds. The land that had nearly cost them everything now provided abundance. The desperate bargain that had brought them together had transformed into a partnership deeper than either could have imagined. 2 years after their wedding, the homestead inspector returned for the final review. Eleanor and Lucas met him with confidence this time, with 2 years of improvements and growth to show off. Rose played at their feet as they reviewed documents, occasionally offering her own unintelligible commentary that made the inspector smile. "Mr. Reed, Mrs. Reed," the inspector said finally, "I'm pleased to approve your homestead claim in its entirety. This land is now officially yours, free and clear." Eleanor felt Lucas's hand find hers, saw the emotion in his eyes as the words sank in. Free and clear. After 15 years of fighting, 8 years of Lucas continuing that fight alone, 2 years of them fighting together, the land was finally, legally, permanently theirs. "Thank you," Lucas managed. "You have no idea what this means." I think I do. The inspector gathered his papers. Not many homesteaders make it through the full 5 years. Even fewer build what you've built here. You should be proud. After he left, Lucas swept Eleanor into his arms and spun her around, startling a laugh from her and a delighted squeal from Rose. We did it, he said, setting Eleanor down but keeping his arms around her. It's over. The claim is ours. No one can take it now. Your father would be proud, Eleanor said softly. Yeah. Lucas's voice was thick. He would be. That evening, they walked together to the hill where James Reed was buried. Lucas had placed a simple wooden marker there years ago, but now he was finally ready to add something permanent. They stood in the cooling twilight, Rose held between them, looking out over the valley. We did it, Dad, Lucas said quietly. Eleanor and me. We kept the land. We built something that'll last. Eleanor placed a hand on the sun-warmed stone they'd brought to mark the grave properly. Thank you for fighting for this place. For giving Lucas something worth protecting. We'll take care of it. We'll make sure it stays in the Reed family for generations. Rose babbled something and reached for a butterfly floating past. They watched it dance away across the valley, across land that had been bought with sweat and blood and determination. What do you think? Lucas asked. Another child? Give Rose a sibling? Eleanor smiled. Maybe, though let's get through her terrible twos first. Fair point. Lucas pulled her close, careful not to squash their daughter between them. I love you, Eleanor Reed. I loved you before I even knew I did. That day you stepped off the stagecoach, I took one look at you and thought, she's too fine for this place. She'll never last. But you proved me wrong about everything. You proposed marriage by sunset to a complete stranger. That takes either courage or insanity. Desperation, Lucas corrected. But it turned out to be the best decision I ever made. For both of us. They stood there as the sun disappeared below the horizon. 3 people where 2 strangers had once made a desperate bargain. The ranch spread out below them, lights beginning to glow in the cabin windows. Tom was probably making dinner in the bunkhouse. Rosa was likely singing to her children. Jessie was courting Annie with increasing seriousness. Life continued, ordinary and extraordinary all at once. Do you ever miss St. Louis? Lucas asked suddenly. The life you left behind? Eleanor considered the question honestly. She thought about the grand houses and social gatherings, the fine clothes and fancy manners. She thought about who she'd been. A banker's daughter, trapped by scandal and social expectation, desperately trying to save a reputation that wasn't worth saving. No, she said finally. That life was beautiful on the surface, but hollow underneath. This, she gestured at the ranch, at their daughter, at Lucas. This is real, hard and dirty and exhausting, but real. I wouldn't trade it for anything. Not even for an easier life, without drought or dust or financial worry? Not even then, because this life is ours. We built it together from nothing. Every fence post, every head of cattle, every small victory. We earned it. Eleanor met his eyes. In St. Louis, I would have been someone's wife, living in someone's house, playing a role assigned to me. Here, I'm Eleanor Reed. I'm your partner. I'm Rose's mother. I'm a rancher's wife by choice, not by necessity. That's worth more than any easy life could ever be. Lucas kissed her then, long and deep, with their daughter giggling between them and the stars emerging overhead. When they finally pulled apart, Eleanor was breathless and smiling. Come on, she said. Let's go home. They walked back down the hill together as darkness settled over the valley. The cabin glowed warm and welcoming, smoke rising from the chimney. Home, real home, built on a foundation of desperation that had transformed into love. Eleanor thought about that desperate woman who'd agreed to marry a stranger by sunset, thought about how terrified she'd been, how uncertain. If she could go back and tell that woman what lay ahead, the fear and fighting, but also the love and partnership and joy, would she still have said yes? Absolutely, without hesitation. Because that desperate bargain had given her everything she'd never known she wanted. A home, a family, a partner who saw her strength instead of her weaknesses. A life that was hers, built with her own hands. Years passed. Rose grew and was joined by two brothers, James, named for Lucas's father, and Thomas, a name Eleanor reclaimed from the man who'd misused it. The ranch prospered. They added more land, expanded the herd, built a proper house to replace the cabin, though Eleanor insisted on keeping the original structure as a guest house. "That cabin is where we started," she said, "where we stopped pretending and became real. I'm not tearing it down." Tom eventually retired, passing management to Miguel. Jesse married Annie and built his own small ranch on adjacent land, the valley filled with families who'd known the terror of Holloway's reign and the relief of his downfall. Eleanor and Lucas grew old together, their love deepening with each passing year. They had arguments and struggles, years when the drought was brutal or the cattle prices dropped. But they faced everything together, the way they'd faced down inspectors and arsonists and threats. On their 20th anniversary, Lucas took Eleanor back to the spot where he'd proposed. The ranch had changed dramatically. More buildings, more people, more prosperity. But the essential character remained the same. Land fought for and kept, passed down to children who would pass it to their children. "Do you remember what you said to me that first day?" Lucas asked, his hair now gray, but his eyes still the same storm cloud gray she'd fallen in love with. "That you were insane for proposing to a stranger." "After that, when I made my outrageous demand," Lucas smiled. "You said, 'What's it going to be, Miss Hayes?' And you said yes, even though you were terrified." "Best decision I ever made." Eleanor took his weathered hand in hers. "Well, second best. The best decision was staying, choosing you every day after that first yes." "I love you, Eleanor Reed, 20 years, and I love you more now than I did then. That's because 20 years ago you barely knew me. You loved the idea of me, the solution I represented." Eleanor reached up and touched his face. "Now you love me. All of me. The stubborn parts, the scared parts, the parts that shot at men in the middle of the night to protect what's ours." Lucas laughed. "Especially those parts. You're fierce, Eleanor. Always have been. I knew it the moment you stepped off that stagecoach with nothing but pride and desperation." They stood together as the sun set, the same sun that had been setting when they'd made their desperate bargain 2 decades earlier. But everything else had changed. They'd changed. Two desperate strangers had become partners, then lovers, then parents, then grandparents as Rose married and had children of her own. The land that had nearly destroyed them had instead become their legacy. The Double R Ranch, built on the foundation of James Reed's stubbornness and Lucas's determination and Eleanor's fierce refusal to give up. It would continue long after they were gone, a testament to what two desperate people could build when they chose to stand together. Years later, when Eleanor was gray and Lucas's hands were gnarled with arthritis, they still sat on the porch in the evenings watching the sunset. Rose ran the ranch now with her husband, while James managed the books and Thomas oversaw the expansion into new territory. "We did good," Lucas said one evening, his voice rough with age but still strong. "Didn't we? Built something that'll last." "We did." Eleanor took his hand, their fingers lacing together as naturally as they had for 40 years. "That desperate bargain turned out pretty well." "Best investment I ever made, $40 a month," Lucas chuckled. "Though I stopped paying you after the first year. I noticed. Decided to let it slide since you were providing other forms of compensation." They laughed together, comfortable with each other in the way only decades of partnership could create. The desperation that had brought them together was long forgotten, replaced by a love that had been tested by everything the harsh territory could throw at them, and emerged stronger for it. Eleanor thought about the woman she'd been when she stepped off that stagecoach. Broken, desperate, willing to accept any terms just to survive. She thought about the journey from there to here, from that terrified yes to a lifetime of choosing each other. "No regrets?" Lucas asked, reading her mind as he so often did. "Not a single one." Eleanor squeezed his hand. "You?" "Only that I didn't propose sooner. Maybe if I'd placed that advertisement a month earlier, we'd have had even more time together. We have exactly the time we were meant to have, and we made the most of every moment." The sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in the colors Eleanor had learned to love, the reds and oranges and purples of Arizona sunsets. In the distance, she could hear her grandchildren playing, their laughter carrying across the valley. The land stretched out before them, green in the spring rains, dotted with cattle and prosperity. This was their legacy. Not just the land or the ranch, but the proof that desperate bargains could transform into love, that strangers could become partners, that survival could evolve into joy. Eleanor Reed closed her eyes and smiled, Lucas's hand warm in hers, surrounded by the life they'd built from nothing but determination and desperate courage. The woman who'd agreed to marry a stranger by sunset had found everything she'd never known she was searching for. Home, family, love that lasted, and it had all started with the most outrageous proposal anyone had ever made, on a blistering July day when Eleanor Hayes had nothing left but pride. "Marry me by sunset," Lucas had demanded, and Eleanor, desperate and terrified and impossibly brave, had said yes. That yes had changed everything. That yes had built a legacy. That yes, Eleanor thought, as the sun disappeared below the horizon, had been the beginning of the rest of her life. And what a beautiful life it had been.